Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, the space where curiosity gets comfortable and questions stretch out long enough for your thoughts to settle. Tonight we're easing into something different from the usual wonders of physics or biology. It's a topic that sits quietly at the edge of our understanding, as steady as the ground under us and somehow less certain than almost anything we can measure. People have looked at it from every angle, examined it with tools old and new, and still found themselves returning to the same stubborn puzzle. We're going to linger with that puzzle, take our time with it, and allow the pieces to sit out in the open without needing to force them into place. You and I are stepping into one of the most intriguing gaps in our entire story as a species, the part of human history that appears to be missing, and that no one has been able to explain in a way that satisfies the evidence we already have. Before we move further into it, I'd like to know where you're listening from tonight. It always feels grounding to imagine you somewhere in your own corner of the world, perhaps settling in for rest, maybe unwinding after a long day, or even just looking for something steady and calm to carry you through a quiet moment. What time is it for you right now? It's a fitting question considering we're about to consider events so old that clocks, calendars, and the entire idea of timekeeping wouldn't have meant anything to the people who lived through them. If what we explore tonight feels comforting, or brings a sense of ease as you drift towards sleep, it would mean a great deal if you'd like the video or subscribe. It helps this little corner reach others who enjoy a slower pace and a chance to think without pressure. Now, as we settle into the main thread, imagine the timeline of human history as something simple. A long line stretching from the present day back through medieval kingdoms, ancient empires, stone monuments, early tools, and then into the scattered beginnings of our species. Most of us learn this line as if it were a smooth sequence. Hunter-gatherers became settled farmers, farming became villages, villages grew into cities, cities developed writing, trade, monuments, and eventually everything that leads to the world we recognize. It's tidy, straightforward, and easy to follow. But the more researchers dig, measure, and compare, the more the line starts to look less like a clean path and more like something with pieces missing. Entire stretches of human development feel out of place. Certain skills seem far too advanced for the time periods they appear in. Some cultures seem to rise suddenly without the long lead-up we expect. Others disappear without leaving the kind of trail that should exist. And then there are physical structures, artifacts, and geological clues that sit in the wrong spots on the timeline entirely. This missing portion of human history isn't a matter of one lost culture or a single mysterious building. It's a broader absence, a hole in the record during which humans clearly existed, maybe even thrived, but left behind evidence that doesn't fit neatly with what should have been possible. You can think of it as a section of a book where the pages were removed long before anyone could make copies, and all that remains are scattered lines written in the margins of chapters that survived. Archaeologists try to piece those lines together, hoping they'll reveal what was once in the missing section, but no matter how much material they gather, something about the picture still feels incomplete. What makes this more challenging is that the Earth itself is not an ideal archivist. Time erodes, buries and transforms. Rain washes away layers of soil. Rivers shift their beds. Wind scrapes surfaces clean. Vegetation grows, dies and returns again. Ice advances and retreats. Volcanoes reshape entire regions. Seas rise and fall. Even plate tectonics move continents slowly but relentlessly. Everything humans leave behind is at the mercy of forces that care nothing about preservation. Stone survives better than wood. Metal survives differently depending on the environment. Organic material rarely lasts unless conditions are perfect. When you imagine how many traces of early humanity may have existed but are now unrecoverable, you start to understand why the gaps appear so wide, yet that explanation alone doesn't fully solve the mystery. The missing portion isn't just a matter of lost pottery or weathered bones. It's the appearance of ideas, technologies and structures that seem to need earlier origins than the timeline allows. It's the sudden shifts in cultural patterns, It's the strange uniformity of certain symbols across regions that shouldn't have been connected. It's the way some ancient sites appear to have been built with methods that seem oddly refined for people supposedly just learning how to plant crops or shape stone tools. These things don't require magic or legends to explain them. They simply require a part of the timeline we haven't uncovered yet, a period when humans may have carried knowledge or practices we haven't recognized or expected. Think of early humans not as simple or primitive, but as creative, adaptable, and deeply observant. Their survival depended on noticing patterns, understanding landscapes, predicting weather, tracking animals, and cooperating with each other. Given enough generations and enough stable environments, they could have developed techniques that left only faint traces behind. Perhaps certain groups built structures we haven't found, crafted tools from materials that didn't survive, or organized themselves in ways that left minimal archaeological footprints. It's possible some communities reached a level of sophistication that didn't leave behind monuments or cities, because their priorities were different from those we associate with progress today. There's also the matter of population. For most of human existence, our numbers were incredibly small compared to today. Small populations mean fewer artifacts, fewer large settlements, fewer durable structures, and a higher chance that everything they left behind could be erased by natural processes. If a culture flourished with a few thousand people, but lived in coastal areas that later submerged, or in forests that grew over their remains, or in regions where erosion was relentless, then the entire span of their existence could vanish almost without a trace. In that case, what we'd find today would be only the faintest hints, subtle clues, and anomalies that don't fit neatly into the standard accounts. One of the more compelling parts of this mystery comes from examining transitions between known periods. There are shifts that feel too abrupt, leaps in knowledge that seem to lack clear foundations. You see organised agriculture appear in several separate parts of the world within a surprisingly short window. You find astronomical alignments built into structures from cultures that supposedly were still struggling with basic engineering. You see populations adapting to climate changes in ways that imply long-term planning. These aren't impossible achievements, but they do suggest people learned or inherited knowledge from sources that don't appear in the archaeological record. When researchers ask where that knowledge came from, they often run into silence. The record shows the results, but hides the origin. The missing portion of human history is not a single event. It's a series of questions that converge on the same point. Why do certain ancient sites appear older than they should? Why do identical symbols appear in regions separated by thousands of miles and with no documented contact? Why do oral traditions from countless cultures reference a time before recorded history when something significant happened, something that reshaped humanity? Why are there sudden disappearances of entire groups without indications of war or migration? Why do some early tools and structures look more refined than those that appear later? These questions don't suggest a lost super-civilization or anything dramatic. They simply point toward a broader, subtler possibility that humans have been developing in ways more complex than we've assumed, and that an entire segment of that development is not documented. Some researchers focus on climate shifts as a possible cause for the missing portion. There were periods of rapid environmental change, including the end of the last ice age, when coastlines changed dramatically. If early humans settled near water, which most evidence suggests they did, many of their communities would now lie underwater. Any structures they built, any tools they used, any stories they carved or etched could be submerged hundreds of feet below current sea levels. The ocean floor holds more unknowns than the surface of Mars, and recovering evidence from there is incredibly difficult. It's entirely possible that a meaningful portion of human prehistory lies beneath waves that have covered it for thousands of years. There's another angle that adds to the puzzle. Some artifacts appear far older than expected, or contain patterns suggesting knowledge of astronomy, geometry, or long-term cycles that early humans shouldn't have recorded yet. When these artifacts show up, they tend to be classified as outliers. But as more of them accumulate, the idea of an outlier becomes harder to defend. At a certain point, the anomalies stop being unusual and start hinting at a consistent underlying story we haven't articulated yet. The missing portion of our history isn't waiting to be written in grand strokes. It's waiting in smaller pieces scattered across continents, buried in sediment, drowned in coastal shelves, and surviving in myths that preserve hints of memories long detached from their original contexts. As we move gradually deeper into this exploration, we're not looking for dramatic revelations or speculative leaps. The goal isn't to imagine civilizations that never existed or technologies far beyond our ancestors. Instead, it's to sit with the real data we have, look at it patiently, and ask why it forms patterns that don't align with the timeline we've constructed. People lived through these periods. They adapted to the world, shaped it in small but meaningful ways, and passed knowledge down through generations. They learned from the land, from each other, and from countless cycles of trial and error. Somewhere between those actions and the archaeological record we rely on, something slipped away. Tonight we're going to trace that quiet absence, not to fill it with guesses, but to understand its shape. When we begin to explore the puzzle buried beneath our feet, it helps to picture the ground not as something still or settled, but as a layered record of everything that came before us. Every handful of soil, every exposed cliff face, every riverbank, and every weathered plateau carries traces of the people who walked there long before any modern tools or measurements existed. The world isn't quiet just because the past is gone. It's quiet because the past is tucked away in pieces, each buried section waiting for someone to notice it. And as simple as that sounds, examining these buried pieces has become one of the most complicated tasks in understanding where humans actually came from, and what they knew long before writing or metal tools or cities took shape. Much of what we know about early people is based on what survived by chance. The Earth did not decide to preserve certain things and discard others. It simply reacted to rainfall, wind, pressure, heat, freezing, thawing, and every other process that works on the surface across thousands of years. When researchers find a fragment of pottery, a piece of bone, a broken tool, or an outline of a dwelling, they try to build a larger picture from these fragments. But the fragments rarely line up in a way that feels complete. They tend to leave out as much as they reveal. They offer clues without explanations, and they create more questions than answers. Each site can feel like the first page of a story without the rest of the book attached to it. Some of the most interesting clues come from places where erosion or natural disasters have exposed layers humans normally wouldn't see. A landslide might reveal a toolkit that looks far more advanced than expected for its depth in the sediment. A dried lake bed might expose markings that appear carefully arranged, as if someone had been tracking patterns in weather or stars long before written records existed. Even a simple arrangement of stones can raise questions if it doesn't look like something a random event would produce. In each case, the discovery begins as a small curiosity, but when compared with other sites, the same curiosity appears somewhere else. Then it appears again. Eventually, these scattered questions turn into a pattern. What makes this especially compelling is the way these patterns show up across continents that would not have had contact with each other at the time. Groups separated by mountain ranges, deserts, oceans, and long distances somehow left behind similar arrangements of shelters, similar methods of tool-making, similar symbolic markings, or similar signs of learning how to manipulate the environment. No clear connection shows how these ideas spread. The usual explanations don't fit as well as they should. It suggests that people either shared a source we haven't identified, or that they carried knowledge through older generations we can't trace. A good example of this appears when looking at how early humans shaped stones. The common belief is that the earliest tools were crude and simple, but in several locations researchers have uncovered stone blades with symmetry and sharpness, suggesting a practiced technique. These blades show consistent angles, repeated patterns of chipping, and intentional shaping that shouldn't appear randomly. What complicates things is that some of these blades are older than the tools found in regions where humans supposedly developed those skills later. It reverses the order of events in a way that doesn't match the established timeline. Instead of gradual improvement in one region spreading outward, the evidence looks like improvement appeared early in multiple locations, and then somehow declined or changed into something less precise before rising again. Another clue emerges when looking at unexpected remains found in sediment layers. There have been discoveries where burned wood, arranged stone platforms, or signs of controlled fire appear much earlier than anticipated. Controlled fire isn't surprising by itself. People learned to use it long before agriculture, but the way fire was used at some sites raises questions. Some fire pits appear to have been built for more than warmth or cooking. They resemble systematic burning for land clearing or group activity that implies planning. At a few sites, the ashes contain mixtures of materials not typically found together naturally. This suggests humans may have been experimenting with heat treatments or using fire for processes that left minimal traces behind. These traces don't confirm advanced technology, but they do hint at organised effort, and that alone creates questions about how people coordinated tasks during a time when they supposedly lived in scattered groups. There's also the matter of footprints. When ancient footprints are discovered, they provide some of the most direct evidence of human presence. But occasionally the arrangement of these prints raises issues. Researchers have found sequences indicating groups walking in organised lines, pairs walking together, or adults positioned near children in a protective arrangement. These details aren't surprising. They reflect normal human behaviour. But what becomes strange is when the number of individuals is larger than expected for early groups, or when the footprints appear near structures or arrangements of stones that don't match the known technology of the era. In some cases, the prints appear next to impressions of wooden posts or shelters that do not survive but leave hints in the ground. These impressions sometimes suggest building methods that appear earlier than the timeline allows. Then there are sites where layers of soil reveal sudden abandonment. A settlement might show evidence of long-term occupation followed by a sharp break. No signs of conflict, no widespread burning, no mass movement. Everything simply stopped. Tools remain unfinished. Food remains left behind. The settlement does not show signs of destruction. It just ends. These breaks happen across multiple regions around similar periods, suggesting something changed that caused people to leave or reorganize their lives suddenly. It could have been climate, disease, or social shifts. But when the pattern repeats widely across distant populations, it raises the issue of whether the missing portion of history involves a shared event or a form of knowledge that influenced how groups responded to challenges. Another part of this puzzle lies in the objects that appear older than expected. There are carvings and engravings found on bones and stones that show animals, shapes, or patterns arranged with surprising precision. Some of these carvings seem to track the phases of the moon or the seasons. Others resemble maps of local terrain. These are not fantasies or exaggerated interpretations. They are real artifacts studied and verified, yet they show a level of abstract thinking and long-term observation usually associated with later civilizations. This does not mean ancient artists created art for symbolic reasons. It simply suggests that someone was paying attention to cycles in nature and recording them in a consistent way. If these carvings are as old as they appear, then humans were observing the world with more structure than we assumed. One of the most persistent questions comes from the way similar symbols appear in regions separated by oceans. For example, spirals, handprints, geometric lines, and animal figures show up in caves across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. While some symbols may simply be intuitive shapes people naturally create, the repeated patterns and methods of placement raise questions. If groups had no contact, why do their markings resemble each other so closely? Some researchers argue that these similarities show how humans naturally express themselves. Others suggest they indicate older shared origins. Both possibilities could be true, but neither fully explains why the symbols appear in clusters that align with other unexpected similarities, such as building methods or early burial traditions. Speaking of burial traditions, there are several early burial sites where individuals were laid to rest with surprising care. People were placed in specific positions or surrounded by objects whose meanings we can only guess at. Some graves contain pigments, tools, or animal remains arranged deliberately. These practices reflect thoughtfulness, but what stands out is how early they appear. They suggest not just respect for the dead, but an understanding of ritual or memory, practices believed to develop much later. These early burials imply that humans were forming social structures much earlier than our models predict. It means people were capable of collective behavior that required communication, shared beliefs, and long-term cooperation. Another intriguing part of the buried puzzle is how early humans interacted with landscapes. Certain regions show signs that people altered the land deliberately. They may have rerouted small streams, cleared vegetation, or created pathways used repeatedly over long periods. These actions do not require advanced technology, but they do require planning. The presence of these landscape modifications earlier than expected challenges the assumption that early humans lived entirely reactively, taking from the environment without shaping it. Instead, the evidence shows they understood how to influence their surroundings in subtle ways that leave minimal physical remains. There are sites where stone blocks appear arranged in ways that don't match natural patterns. These blocks are not cut with metal tools and do not form large monuments. They appear as foundations or platforms built from locally available stone. What makes them unusual is the symmetry and repeated design. They show intentional placement and a desire for stability. In some cases, the blocks are shaped through a process that involves heating and cooling, a method not associated with stone structures until much later. Again, these are not examples of impossible technology. They are signs of experimentation and planning that complicate the timeline. Another detail lies in the distribution of early settlements. In several regions, settlements appear in clusters rather than as single isolated communities. These clusters suggest that groups were larger or more interconnected than expected. They may have shared resources, exchanged ideas, or moved between sites seasonally. If that was the case, it means early humans were not only mobile, but organised enough to return to certain areas repeatedly with purpose. And yet, the archaeological evidence between these clusters is sparse. This absence creates the impression of missing threads, as if much of the activity occurred in ways that didn't leave durable traces. Sometimes the puzzle emerges not in what is found, but in what is not found. There are gaps in the toolmaking sequence, gaps in the record of structures, gaps in the progression from one cultural pattern to the next. These gaps aren't empty spaces waiting for dramatic explanations. They are reminders that most human activity involved perishable materials, wood, fibres, hides, simple shelters, and light tools all decay quickly. If early humans used these materials extensively, much of what they created could have disappeared beyond recognition. This would leave behind only occasional items that survived by chance, making their world appear simpler than it was. The pieces of the puzzle don't point to a single answer. They point to a larger, quieter truth. Humans have lived through periods we barely understand, and their efforts, ideas, and adaptations are buried beneath layers of earth that keep most of their story out of sight. The puzzle remains open, waiting for more pieces to surface, and each discovery deepens the picture rather than completing it. When we try to understand civilizations that faded long before their stories should have ended, we enter a part of human history where the evidence behaves strangely. Some cultures appear in the archaeological record with signs of stability, organization, and innovation, only to disappear abruptly. Their structures remain. Their tools stay scattered in the soil. Their symbols endure on stone, in pigments, and on pottery. Yet the people who built them leave almost no indication of where they went or why their societies dissolved so quickly. These places pull researchers into long debates about origins and timelines, and the more closely they're studied, the more they seem to share one unsettling feature. They vanish in ways that don't match the usual explanations. When a culture collapses, we usually expect signs of conflict, famine, or disease. We look for burnt walls, broken weapons, or layers of destruction that indicate violence. We expect to find graves that show abrupt increases in mortality. We look for evidence of failed harvests, droughts, or environmental change. But many of these early societies show none of that. Instead of ruins that signal a dramatic end, they show abandonment. Tools left in the middle of construction, food storage partially full, everyday items arranged as if someone expected to return. It creates the impression not of catastrophe, but of people walking away from their homes for reasons we cannot identify. Some of the most puzzling examples are found in places where early forms of coordinated building appear long before expected. People constructed multi-room dwellings, shared courtyards, and storage areas arranged with care. They used architectural patterns that require planning, cooperation, and communication among many individuals. These communities lasted long enough to establish routines, raise children, and create traditions. Yet after generations of occupation, the traces end abruptly. There is no sign of forced departure, no signs of gradual decline. The timeline simply stops. Whatever caused the abandonment leaves behind only questions. This raises the issue of how these societies formed in the first place. If they developed in isolation, they would need long periods to learn how to build, farm, organize, and develop the skills required for community life. But the evidence often shows that these settlements appear fully formed. The earliest layers already contain planned dwellings rather than simple temporary structures. Storage systems are already in place. Food preparation areas are already organized. In some cases, symbols or markings appear from the earliest phase instead of gradually emerging. It's as if the knowledge to live this way arrived with the first settlers rather than evolving slowly. Another clue comes from their tools. Many of these societies crafted implements from stone, bone, and other available materials with consistency. They shaped blades with refined techniques. They built grinding stones with smooth surfaces meant for repeated use. They carved figurines or engravings that suggest symbolic thinking. These items show practice and intention. They also appear in patterns that indicate knowledge was being shared across families or groups. But once again, the sudden disappearance interrupts the continuity. The precise tools end, the symbols stop, the structures remain empty, and the next phase of human activity in the region often looks entirely different. This abrupt break forces researchers to ask whether these people moved elsewhere. If they relocated, there should be traces of where they went, but most of the time, those traces don't appear. The next population to occupy the land usually has a different style, a different way of building, a different set of tools. The two groups rarely overlap in ways that indicate direct transfer of knowledge. Instead, it gives the appearance of a gap, as if the earlier society left and the new one arrived much later, unaware of what had existed before. This deepens the sense that something important is missing. There's also the problem of similarity across great distances. Some of these early societies built structures aligned with common orientations. Others used recurring symbols or decorative marks. Some shared methods of tool production that appear nearly identical. The regions where these similarities show up were separated by geography that should have prevented easy contact. Yet the patterns persist. This suggests people either spread with their knowledge across large distances or inherited practices from an older source no longer visible in the record. One example appears in settlements that use circular arrangements of dwellings. Each dwelling had a consistent layout. The doorways often faced the same direction. Pathways between structures were worn into the ground in a way that indicates repeated, organised use. These arrangements are not unique to one culture. They appear thousands of miles apart. Their presence doesn't prove a direct connection. But seeing such similar planning in societies that weren't aware of each other raises questions about where the idea came from. It might be independent invention, but the similarities run deeper than simple practicality. Another clue lies in the presence of early communal structures. Some societies built central spaces that were larger than their personal dwellings. These spaces could have been used for storage, meetings, ceremonies, or shared food preparation. They show that people understood the importance of collective activity, yet these structures often vanish at the same moment the rest of the settlement is abandoned. It's not that the community grew slowly weaker over time, it's that everything stops at once. This pattern appears repeatedly across regions that have no documented contact, creating the sense of a shared phenomenon without a known cause. What makes this even more intriguing is how these societies seem to appear earlier than expected. For decades, the common view was that large organised structures only emerged after agriculture became stable. But as excavations reach older and older layers, the data has forced many to reconsider. There are places where complex buildings appear before clear evidence of farming. There are sites where symbolic carvings appear before signs of large populations. This reverses the order of events. Instead of agriculture enabling community life, it sometimes looks like community life existed first and agriculture was adopted afterward. That shift implies the existence of a social structure whose origin is not accounted for. Some researchers propose that these societies formed as seasonal gatherings rather than permanent settlements. That might explain the sudden abandonment. People could have returned each year for specific purposes and stopped when circumstances changed. But that explanation doesn't fully match the evidence. Many of the structures built in these places required long-term construction, maintenance and planning. Seasonal gatherings can involve large groups, but they rarely involve permanent architecture, organised storage systems, or intricate tools left behind in the soil. The level of investment suggests that people lived there consistently, at least for a significant period. Another unusual aspect of these vanished societies is the presence of standardization. In many cases, tools are shaped with similar angles across multiple households. Decorative elements follow shared rules. Carved motifs repeat in predictable ways. Standardization indicates cooperation and communication across groups. It also suggests a shared set of practices passed down through many generations. But when the society disappears, the standardization disappears with it. The next population in the region usually has entirely different forms of organization, as if the knowledge was not transferred. If the society had simply moved, they would likely continue these practices in the new location. Instead, it's as though the knowledge simply ended. Climate shifts are often considered as explanations, and in some regions they likely played a role. But climate changes do not explain every case. Some sites show evidence of stable climates during the period of abandonment. Others show populations living in the same region before and after the vanished society with no signs of interruption. If climate caused the collapse, the people who came later would have faced the same challenges. The absence of consistent environmental triggers complicates efforts to link all these cases through natural causes alone. There are also examples where early societies appear to have discovered methods of shaping the environment that seem mature for their time. They diverted small streams for irrigation. They cultivated or encouraged the growth of certain plants. They created terraces or platforms in hilly areas to stabilize the ground. These actions require observation, planning, and cooperation. But again, these methods vanish with the society. The next occupants often rely on simpler strategies, only developing similar techniques much later. This backward movement in knowledge doesn't match what we usually expect from continuous human development. Another piece of the puzzle involves trade materials. In some abandoned sites, objects appear that originated hundreds of miles away. These materials include shells, pigments, stone types, and other items that require long-distance travel or well-organised exchange. If these communities had connections that extended far beyond their immediate surroundings, it suggests a wider network than the timeline predicts. Yet the network disappears with the society. The next population shows no signs of maintaining it. The trade routes stop. The materials no longer appear. It leaves the sense of an interconnected world that briefly existed and then dissolved completely. There are even more puzzling cases where structures show advanced planning, but do not seem to have been used long enough to justify the effort. Some buildings have carefully engineered drainage systems, others have foundations built to withstand shifting soil. Still others show evidence of coordinated construction using consistent measurements. But the occupation layers above them are thin, suggesting people left soon after building. It raises questions about why they stopped using these structures. The disappearance feels abrupt rather than gradual. In a few places, carvings or symbols appear on walls, stones, or objects that show surprising detail. These markings often depict animals, people, patterns, or scenes that might reflect stories, beliefs, or knowledge. Yet these carvings stop when the society disappears. The next culture to inhabit the region uses different symbols, creating another break in continuity. It suggests a pause in the shared human narrative, a missing thread that interrupts the connection between earlier and later groups. As each of these clues accumulates, the picture grows more complicated. The pattern isn't one of a single lost culture or dramatic collapse. It's a pattern of societies emerging earlier than expected, developing practices that imply shared knowledge, reaching points of stability, and then vanishing in ways that do not match known causes. These societies were real. They left behind structures, tools, art, and signs of daily life. But the reasons for their disappearance remain uncertain. This uncertainty does not point toward conclusions beyond the evidence. Instead, it highlights the possibility that the missing portion of human history involves periods of development that left minimal traces, interwoven with societies that rose quickly, lived with surprising organization, and then dispersed or changed direction in ways that are not yet clear. What remains of them rests in the soil, quietly reminding us that our understanding of the past is still incomplete. Some puzzles in human history don't announce themselves with grand monuments or dramatic discoveries. They appear quietly, hidden in small details that don't behave the way they should. These details show up in soil layers, tool fragments, architectural remnants, carvings, and scattered artifacts that stand out because they don't match the period they belong to. Instead of blending into the timeline, they challenge it. They sit in the wrong era, with qualities that should only appear much later. These anomalies are not rare accidents. They accumulate with each new excavation, each new survey, and each new comparison between distant sites. And at a certain point, the number of mismatched details becomes too large to dismiss as simple coincidence. Often, the first sign that something is out of place appears during routine excavations. Researchers expect to find tools, structures, or remains consistent with the known development of the region. But sometimes an object is discovered that doesn't match the rest of the material from the layer it sits in. Maybe the stone tool shows a type of precision that shouldn't exist yet. Maybe a piece of pottery carries markings that belong to a much later style. Or maybe a structure appears with construction methods that contradict everything known about the era. In those moments, the entire timeline becomes uncertain. These inconsistencies often prompt further investigations, and as layers are re-examined, more discrepancies surface. In one region, a structure may show a type of alignment that suggests knowledge of celestial patterns far earlier than expected. In another, carvings appear that depict animals or shapes with a level of detail that requires careful observation over long periods. In yet another site, the arrangement of stones follows a repeated mathematical pattern that usually emerges only after written records appear. None of these finds imply advanced technology or lost supercultures. Instead, they raise a simpler question. Why do people in these early eras seem to know things they should not have learned until much later? Sometimes the anomalies involve materials that don't belong in certain layers. A specific pigment might appear earlier than its known origin. A type of hearth might show signs of controlled temperatures that require techniques associated with later cultures. Animal remains might be arranged in patterns that indicate ritual or symbolic behavior earlier than expected. When these pieces appear alone, they might be explained through misplacement or natural mixing of layers. But when the same types of anomalies show up repeatedly in multiple regions, the explanation becomes less convincing. One of the more persistent questions involves the sudden appearance of refined craftsmanship. In several ancient settlements, the earliest tools found are not the simplest ones. Instead, they appear at a level of refinement that suggests long-term practice. These tools might include symmetrical blades, polished surfaces, or standardized shapes that require more skill than the timeline predicts for the earliest inhabitants. Instead of a gradual improvement from crude designs to skilled production, the record sometimes shows skilled production arriving at the start and then becoming simpler in later layers. This reversal challenges the standard model of steady linear development. The same pattern shows up in architecture. In places where early humans built structures, the oldest foundations sometimes contain elements that seem unexpectedly organized. The spacing between supports might be consistent. The orientation of buildings might follow a predictable pattern. The materials might show signs of careful preparation. Later structures built on top of these older ones occasionally show less precision or entirely different methods, as if the knowledge used by the first builders was not passed on. This interruption in continuity is difficult to explain through normal cultural development. Symbolic artifacts also present difficulties. Early carvings, paintings, or markings often demonstrate not only artistic expression, but also patterns that look intentional and repeated across generations. Some carvings align with seasonal cycles, lunar phases, or animal migration patterns. Others resemble maps of the surrounding landscape. These examples of long-term observation imply a depth of knowledge inconsistent with the assumed mobility and lifestyle of early humans during those periods. If people were primarily focused on immediate survival, where did they find the time or stability to record these patterns so thoroughly? Another category of anomalies involves large stone placements. Not monumental structures, but smaller arrangements that show clear geometric intent. These might involve groups of stones placed in circles, lines, or grids. The stones may not be shaped or carved, but they appear in patterns that reflect measurement, repetition, and awareness of spatial relationships. What complicates matters is that many of these patterns resemble later mathematical or architectural principles, but appear thousands of years earlier. The issue is not the stones themselves. The issue is the planning required to place them consistently. Traces of long-distance movement also raise questions. Some early communities have objects made from materials found hundreds of miles away. A particular type of obsidian may appear far from its source. Shells from distant coasts show up in inland settlements. Mineral pigments found in caves might originate from quarries across entire mountain ranges. These discoveries imply movement or exchange systems far more extensive than predicted for the era. The challenge is not that early humans were incapable of travelling long distances. The challenge is understanding how materials travelled consistently enough to show up in multiple sites without leaving clearer traces of the journeys. Occasionally researchers uncover hearths or kilns that reach temperatures that seem difficult to achieve with simple fire pits. These heating methods might involve insulating materials, airflow control, or repeated heating cycles. If early humans accomplished this intentionally, it implies experimentation and problem-solving that predate the technologies typically associated with such practices. If the high temperatures occurred naturally, the consistency of the patterns remains difficult to explain. The repeated appearance of these features across distant regions suggests something more deliberate than natural coincidence. Burial sites contribute another set of inconsistencies. Some early burials include items arranged in careful patterns or placed in positions that indicate symbolic meaning. Pigments might be applied to the body. Certain objects might be placed near the hands or feet. The grave may be lined with stones set in deliberate formations. This type of burial behaviour suggests a level of social structure and shared belief earlier than expected. But the most unusual aspect is how these burial traditions appear suddenly and then disappear. The next population in the same region might use entirely different burial practices with no signs of influence from the earlier group. Even food remains create anomalies. In a few sites, plant residues indicate selective gathering or early cultivation much earlier than the accepted dates for agriculture. The evidence doesn't prove farming, but it does suggest that people were experimenting with or favouring certain plants. If these practices were already developing, it raises the possibility that early humans understood seasonal cycles and plant behaviour more deeply than previously believed. Yet these early experiments often vanish in the following layers, and agriculture doesn't appear for thousands of years afterward. This disconnect challenges the idea of continuous development. Another type of anomaly comes from evidence of long-term settlement in areas assumed to be temporary. Some sites show layers of occupation that last far longer than expected for hunter-gatherer groups. The waste build-up, the wear on pathways, and the accumulation of debris all indicate that people returned to the same place repeatedly, or perhaps lived there permanently for extended periods. But permanent settlements are usually associated with agriculture or pastoralism. Without evidence of these systems, long-term occupation becomes difficult to explain. It implies an organisation of a life that doesn't match the timeline. There are also older layers containing tools or structures that appear more advanced than those found above them. This inversion suggests a decline in knowledge or a shift away from certain practices, but declines typically happen through gradual change. Here, the shift often appears sudden. One layer shows refined techniques, the next shows simpler forms. This pattern repeats across continents, implying a common process that affected many groups. Understanding why early humans would abandon effective methods for simpler ones remains challenging. The presence of drainage channels or controlled water flow systems in early settlements provides yet another unexpected pattern. These channels show that people understood how water behaved in different seasons. They built features that directed or slowed water movement. They may have used stones or packed earth to stabilize banks. These systems require planning and familiarity with weather patterns, yet they appear in societies that supposedly had not yet developed the social structures needed for such coordination. Even the diets of some early communities challenge expectations. Analysis of remains shows that certain groups consumed balanced mixtures of plants, fish, and animals that suggest seasonal planning. They appear to have understood when certain resources became available and organised their movement or gathering accordingly. This level of planning contradicts the idea of fully nomadic lifestyles driven only by immediate opportunity. It suggests strategies for survival that require long-term knowledge. In a few rare cases, markings on bones or stones show an unexpected understanding of numbering or counting. These markings might follow sequences or track cycles. They do not resemble writing, but they do suggest a method of recording information. If early humans were tracking quantities or repeating cycles, then they were paying attention to patterns in the environment. That alone challenges the typical timeline for the emergence of such behaviour. What stands out across all these anomalies is how consistently they appear in the earliest layers of occupation. They do not follow predictable patterns of gradual invention. They do not show smooth linear development from simple to complex. Instead, they appear fully formed, disappear, reappear centuries later, and sometimes vanish entirely. This irregular pattern suggests that early humans had knowledge or practices that were not preserved, lost over generations, or simply remain hidden from the archaeological record. As more data accumulates, the timeline becomes less of a clean sequence and more of a patchwork. The anomalies do not point to a single cause. They reflect missing links, forgotten practices, interrupted traditions, and connections that may have existed long before they left physical traces. Every so often, an excavation produces something that forces researchers to stop and rethink what they thought they understood about early human capabilities. These finds aren't dramatic in appearance. They aren't machines, mechanisms, or anything resembling the inventions that would eventually define later civilizations. Instead, they are simple objects or construction methods that carry features far ahead of the period to which they belong. Each one suggests skills that shouldn't have existed yet, knowledge that should have taken thousands more years to develop, or methods that seem out of place given everything else found in the same layers. At first glance, nothing about these discoveries looks extraordinary, but when examined carefully, they reveal techniques that require practice, intention, and understanding beyond what the timeline comfortably allows. Many of these unusual finds appear as tools made with surprising precision. When stone tools first emerge in the archaeological record, the common expectation is that they will be crude, chipped quickly, and shaped mainly for immediate use. But in several locations, the earliest tools show geometry that implies deliberate planning. Edges are shaped with consistent angles. The surfaces are evenly thinned. The symmetry is too exact to be accidental. To achieve this level of precision, a person would need to understand the behavior of stone under pressure and plan the points of impact in advance. It suggests technique rather than chance. And while later periods contain many refined tools, their sudden appearance at such early dates introduces a layer of complexity that doesn't match the typical developmental progression. Another unexpected feature appears in early examples of adhesives. Several ancient tools show evidence of being hafted, attached to handles using binding materials. Hafting itself is not surprising, but the adhesives used in some early cases show chemical compositions that require controlled heating, mixing, and preparation. Creating these adhesives involves processes that must be carried out carefully. Heating the materials too much makes them brittle. Heating them too little makes them ineffective. Achieving the right balance requires knowledge passed down through practice. Yet these adhesives appear in layers far older than the timeline suggests they should. They indicate experimentation and understanding that seems to arrive fully formed rather than gradually developed. Construction sites provide another category of anomalies. Some early structures use stones shaped and arranged to interlock in ways that resist shifting. These interlocking methods appear in places where metal tools did not exist and where simple stacking would have been expected. Instead, the stones fit together with edges that complement each other. They may not form monumental walls, but even small platforms or foundations reveal the same unexpected precision. Achieving this fit without metal requires controlled chipping and the ability to visualize the final arrangement. The presence of such techniques at early stages of human settlement raises questions about where the knowledge came from and why it appears abruptly. Controlled heating also plays a significant role in these technological puzzles. In several early sites, researchers have found evidence of people using heat to alter the characteristics of stone before shaping it. Heat-treating stone improves its flaking properties, making it easier to shape into sharp blades. This process requires not only fire, but also a stable temperature over extended periods. Maintaining this temperature would require consistent fuel, airflow control, and monitoring. The idea that early humans used heat treatment is not new, but the dates associated with some of these finds push the practice far earlier than expected. It implies people had the patience and understanding to manipulate materials in ways that go beyond the simple use of fire for warmth or cooking. In addition to stone, early traces of metalworking present another difficulty. While metal tools do not appear widely until much later, small beads or pigments made from metallic minerals sometimes show signs of heating or chemical alteration. These processes would require intentional experimentation with materials that respond differently to heat than stone or clay. If people were able to alter these minerals at early dates, even on a small scale, it suggests they explored how different substances behaved under fire long before they began producing metal tools. This experimentation does not imply advanced metallurgy, but does indicate curiosity and methodical efforts to understand material properties. Water management techniques also appear earlier than expected. Some ancient communities built channels that directed water through settlements or fields. These channels may be small, but the placement reflects knowledge of seasonal flow patterns. The builders understood how water moved through the landscape and how to guide it. A few channels show evidence of having been lined with stones to prevent erosion. Others use gravel layers to improve drainage. These features require planning and cooperation, traits that challenge the idea that early humans were primarily focused on short-term survival without long-term environmental modification. Even more intriguing are the early examples of drilling. Some artifacts show holes drilled through stone or bone with remarkable consistency. To create these holes, early humans would need to rotate a tool repeatedly, applying even pressure while keeping the angle consistent. Experimental archaeology shows that creating such holes requires patience and method, yet the drilled items appear in layers suggesting humans developed this skill much earlier than expected. These holes may have been used to attach objects, create ornaments, or secure bindings, each of which reflects foresight and understanding of engineering principles. A similar pattern emerges with early textiles. Actual fabric rarely survives, but impressions in clay and preserved fibres found in rare conditions show weaving techniques that require knowledge of patterns, tension, and coordination. These early textiles are not simple or loosely formed. They demonstrate uniform spacing and structured weaving. Producing them would require tools such as spindles, looms, or frames that also rarely survive. The existence of such textiles in early layers challenges assumptions that complex weaving developed only after settled agricultural societies formed. Instead, it suggests that portable weaving technologies may have existed long before permanent structures or fields appeared. Ceramics also raise questions. In several places, pottery appears suddenly in the record with shapes and firing methods that usually take generations to refine. Some of the earliest pottery shows controlled firing that prevents cracking. Others display consistent thickness or distinct decorative patterns. These characteristics imply that people were not experimenting for the first time. Pottery, once adopted, should evolve gradually. But many early examples appear with techniques that seem mature from the outset. Later pottery in the same region may even appear less refined, reinforcing the idea that knowledge arrived suddenly and possibly faded before being rediscovered. The methods used to transport heavy stones provide another layer of mystery. Even without monumental structures, some early settlements include stones weighing far more than a few individuals could lift easily. Their placement implies coordinated movement or the use of tools such as levers, rollers, or ramps. These methods require understanding mechanical advantage. They also demand cooperation and planning. The fact that these heavy stones appear in early settlements indicates that humans were solving engineering problems long before the timeline suggests the development of such skills. Fire control presents yet another puzzle. In some early hearths, the arrangement of stones or clay indicates people were managing airflow to maintain hotter, cleaner fires. These hearths sometimes include side channels or enclosing walls. They might show ash layers arranged in patterns suggesting repeated adjustments. Such features point toward intentional modification rather than simple fire use. Maintaining a stable fire suitable for heat treatment or food processing requires attention and understanding, not just chance ignition. The presence of pigments adds to the uncertainty. Some early pigments show remarkable stability, suggesting they were processed with binders or treated with heat. Creating durable pigments requires understanding how different materials interact. It also involves preparing them in ways that prevent fading. The fact that some pigments survive tens of thousands of years in vibrant condition suggests a surprising degree of experimentation and control at a stage when people supposedly lacked the means or need for such efforts. Another area of complexity involves early evidence of measurement. Certain sites contain stones or features placed at consistent intervals. Others include markings that appear to track repetitive cycles. These markings may reflect counting or simple record-keeping, yet their presence implies cognitive abilities that align with later agricultural and administrative societies, not nomadic groups with limited need for formal measurement. If early humans were tracking time, distance, or quantity in these ways, it signals another instance where the timeline appears out of sequence. More confounding are early examples of geometric shapes carved or arranged in natural materials. These shapes include circles, triangles, and grids that require intention and symmetry. They appear in regions that should not have possessed the cultural framework for such patterns yet. While these shapes do not prove advanced mathematics, they do show awareness of consistent proportions and spatial relationships earlier than expected. Another recurring question involves the discovery of residues from composite tools. Some early implements combine multiple materials, stone, wood, fibre and adhesive, assembled with skill. Creating such tools requires an understanding of how each component contributes to the overall function. The adhesive must bond well, the shaft must balance the weight, the stone must be shaped appropriately. This level of integration contradicts the assumption that early humans relied mainly on simple tools with minimal assembly. Transporting goods across large distances introduces another category of anomalies. Some early communities contain items from geographically distant regions, such as exotic stones or shells. Transporting these materials requires planning, negotiation, or repeated movement across large territories. This level of mobility suggests communication networks or trade systems long before the timeline predicts such complexity. Even the use of sound creates difficulties. A few early objects may have been instruments. They include hollow bones with holes placed at intervals that could produce tones. If these objects were used to create sound intentionally, it implies knowledge of acoustics and the ability to replicate tones. The placement of holes would need to be controlled. Producing consistent sound requires more than random experimentation. If people were creating instruments, it suggests another dimension of early cognition not fully reflected in the timeline. Storage systems present additional contradictions. In some early sites, pits or containers appear that could preserve food or resources for long periods. These storage features often show signs of insulation, sealing, or elevation above ground. Such methods reflect long-term planning rather than spontaneous use. If these systems existed earlier than agriculture, they challenge the idea that food storage developed only after stable farming communities formed. Another perplexing feature involves the intentional shaping of landscapes on a small scale. Evidence suggests early humans built low walls, simple terraces, or modified slopes to control erosion or create defensible areas. These modifications show understanding of environmental processes. They also suggest cooperation within the community. Yet these features appear too early for the societal structures normally associated with such work. Collectively, these early technological anomalies do not point toward dramatic theories. Instead, they highlight gaps in the record. They reflect knowledge that must have existed in forms that did not survive. They show that early humans experimented, learned, adapted, and possibly forgot techniques over time. These skills may have developed in pockets of stability, passed down through generations, and then vanished when environmental or social conditions changed. Each anomaly serves as a reminder that the timeline of human development is not as smooth as once believed. Skills appear suddenly, disappear, and re-emerge later. Techniques arrive earlier than expected. Experiments occur long before stable societies form. Across the study of ancient history, one of the most difficult challenges is not what we find, but what we don't. The gaps between discoveries often say as much as the artifacts themselves. Some stretches of time contain long periods where human activity should be visible and yet nothing appears. These spans aren't short interruptions caused by environmental damage or erosion. They are broad intervals where entire regions fall silent, leaving behind no tools, no structures, no hearths, no carvings, and no clear evidence that people lived there at all. The absence becomes its own kind of information, pointing to something missing in the timeline, something that once existed but left almost no trace. Archaeological records depend on preservation, and preservation is never guaranteed. Soil chemistry, temperature, moisture, fire, flooding, and countless other natural processes determine what survives. But even with these difficulties, the patterns of silence don't align neatly with expected causes. In some places, earlier layers contain abundant signs of human life. Tools, bones, pigments, and shelters all appear. Then suddenly an entire sequence of sediment offers nothing. After that empty interval, traces of humanity return again. The silence sits between two active periods like a page removed from a book. These quiet intervals appear across continents. They occur in valleys, on plateaus, along coastlines and in caves. Regions that once supported thriving groups suddenly stop producing evidence. The assumption might be that people moved elsewhere, but when researchers examine neighbouring regions for continuity, they often find similar silences. It creates broad, empty zones, not just small gaps. And when these zones are compared across timelines, they sometimes overlap, forming periods where humanity as a whole seems to retreat from visibility. Some researchers believe these gaps may reflect shifts in mobility. If people became more nomadic for a time, they might leave fewer traces. Nomadic groups produce lighter archaeological footprints. They rely on perishable materials that decay quickly. Their shelters might be temporary structures of wood, fibre, or skins that vanish almost entirely. Their tools might be reused until they break beyond recognition. Their lifestyles would not leave the kind of durable debris needed for preservation. This explanation helps account for parts of the record, yet it doesn't settle everything. The size of these gaps often exceeds what nomadic life alone can explain. In some cases, the missing intervals stretch across thousands of years. Nomadic groups still make fires, butcher animals, discard broken tools, and create temporary structures that leave evidence behind. They still impact soil layers, produce waste, and alter landscapes. Even a lightly mobile group would leave something. But in the silent intervals, the soil reveals nothing at all, not even the faint chemical traces that usually remain after repeated human presence. This raises questions about population levels. One possibility is that human groups became so small during certain periods that their impact was negligible. Perhaps environmental pressures reduce populations to the point where entire generations lived without leaving lasting marks. But the silence often appears in places where earlier populations were strong and where later populations were even stronger. The gaps don't align with known climatic downturns. They don't match the timing of glacial advances, droughts, or volcanic activity. They appear instead in periods where conditions were stable enough that people should have continued using the landscape. Another issue involves the disappearance of certain tool traditions. Some early cultures produced distinctive styles of tools. These styles spread across large areas and last for long periods. Then they vanish entirely. When another tool style emerges later, it shows no connection to the earlier one. There is no transitional form linking them. The absence of transitional tools suggests either a population replacement or a loss of knowledge. But neither explanation fully clarifies the silence. If new populations moved in, they should have left evidence of their arrival. If knowledge was lost, some partial form should survive in the archaeological record. Instead, there is nothing. There are also places where unusual structures appear in early layers only to disappear completely afterward. These structures might be simple foundations, storage pits, or communal spaces. Their designs do not match those found in later periods. They seem to belong to a tradition that appears once and never returns. After these structures vanish, centuries may pass before any building activity reappears in the region. This break is difficult to interpret. It suggests that an architectural style developed, was used for a time, and then either forgotten or abandoned for reasons that remain unclear. Plant and animal remains add another layer to the mystery. In some regions, early layers show consistent patterns of hunting, gathering, or food preparation. Specific species appear regularly, indicating that people relied on stable sources of nutrition. Then the pattern stops. Not only do the species disappear from the human layers, but the human layers themselves vanish. After a long interval, different species appear with different patterns of consumption. This shift implies that human behaviour changed dramatically between the active periods, but without transitional evidence, the cause remains unknown. Burial practices also fade in and out of view. Some early groups buried their dead in ways that are identifiable, even after thousands of years. They might use pigments, place objects in the grave, or position the body in a consistent manner. Then suddenly, for long stretches, burial traditions vanish. It is not that people stopped dying, it is that they stopped leaving behind traces of how they responded to death. Either the practices changed to methods that do not preserve well, or cultural traditions shifted in ways that left no lasting mark. Whatever the cause, the silence in burial evidence is as striking as the silence in living spaces. Some archaeologists suggest that the gaps reflect simply the limits of current excavation. Much of the world has not been explored beneath the surface. Many regions remain untouched due to political, environmental or logistical reasons. It is possible that the missing pieces exist but haven't been discovered yet. While this explanation accounts for some gaps, it does not align with the global nature of the pattern. The silences appear in places that have been extensively studied, as well as in places that remain mostly unexplored. The consistency of the timing across large geographic scales suggests something deeper than random chance. Another complication arises when examining soil chemistry. Human presence often leaves chemical signatures. These signatures include elevated levels of phosphorus, nitrogen or carbon from repeated fires, food waste, and organic decay. Even if physical artifacts disappear, the soil usually retains chemical traces. But in the silent intervals, these signatures are absent. The soil reads as untouched, as if people simply were not there. This absence of chemical evidence reinforces the idea that the silence is not a matter of missing artifacts, but a genuine interruption. Some researchers propose that these gaps reflect shifts in cultural behaviour that produced fewer durable remains. Perhaps early humans shifted toward practices that were less material and more behavioural. They could have relied more heavily on natural shelters. They might have used tools made primarily from wood, bone or fibre that decayed quickly. If their activities left minimal waste, even prolonged occupation might leave little to find. Yet this explanation struggles with the scale of the silence. It is unlikely that multiple populations across vast regions all adopted similar low-impact lifestyles simultaneously, unless a shared cause influenced them. There are also questions about areas where landscapes appear altered without clear signs of human presence. For example, some regions show patterns of burning in vegetation that suggest deliberate use of fire to manage resources, but there are no tools, shelters or remains nearby. This suggests a possibility that humans were present and active, but left almost nothing behind beyond ecological impact. If that is the case, the silence might reflect a shift toward practices that are nearly invisible archaeologically. This interpretation fits some cases, but not all. Another aspect worth considering comes from genetic studies. DNA evidence sometimes shows population expansions or contractions that do not align with the archaeological record. There are periods when genetic diversity increases, suggesting growth and movement. But the physical evidence of that movement is missing. Similarly, there are times when genetic bottlenecks imply reduced populations, yet the archaeological record shows stable activity. These mismatches indicate that something significant occurred during certain periods that left little to no physical trace. Linguistic studies introduce another dimension. Some language families show patterns suggesting ancient dispersals that do not align with known migrations. The languages share roots that imply earlier movements than the archaeological record supports. This disconnect between linguistic timelines and material evidence points again to periods of human history that are poorly understood and underrepresented in the archaeological record. Even more intriguing are the rare instances where artifacts from older layers resemble those from much later periods, bypassing the silent intervals entirely. These artifacts appear as early examples of techniques or designs that do not reappear until millennia later. Their presence indicates that certain ideas existed early on, vanished during the silent periods, and re-emerged later in new contexts. This suggests that knowledge was lost and rediscovered rather than passed continuously from generation to generation. If knowledge was lost, the silence may represent periods when cultural transmission broke down, or populations shrank to levels where shared practices could not be maintained. Climate records also complicate the picture. Ice cores, lake sediments, and pollen samples show environmental conditions that don't always align with human presence. Some silent periods occur during stable climates, when resources should have been abundant. In other cases, evidence of human presence appears during more difficult climates, defying assumptions about population resilience. These inconsistencies suggest that environmental factors alone cannot explain the gaps. The archaeological silence becomes even more striking when compared to oral traditions. Many cultures have stories describing earlier ages of humanity, times before recorded history when significant events shaped the world. These stories vary across regions, yet many share themes of destruction, migration, or transformation. While oral traditions cannot be used as direct evidence, their widespread appearance raises the possibility that people retained memories of earlier disruptions even when material traces disappeared. The silence in the physical record might align with those remembered disruptions. Another layer of mystery appears when examining fauna. In some regions, animal populations show signs of human interaction, such as selective hunting or changes in migration patterns, during periods when the archaeological record shows no humans. This suggests that people were present but not leaving material traces. If humans used lightweight tools or temporary structures, they might alter local ecosystems without leaving behind durable artifacts. The culmination of all these contradictions paints a picture of human history that is far less linear than once believed. Instead of a steady progression from simple to complex, the record shows interruptions, disappearances, and re-emergences. Cultures rise, vanish, and return in new forms. Populations expand, shrink, move, and modify their lifestyles. Knowledge emerges, fades, and reappears. The silence between these moments is not empty. It reflects processes we have not yet understood or identified. As these silent periods accumulate across regions and eras, they point toward a deeper issue. Something fundamental about early human history remains obscured. The silence is not random. It follows patterns that suggest missing links in cultural continuity, shifts in social organization, or events that have left a little trace in the soil. In many parts of the world, some of the oldest information we have about early humanity does not come from soil, stone, or bones. It comes from stories. These stories were told aloud long before writing existed, carried across generations by memory alone. They were repeated around fires, woven into daily life, and passed from elders to children for hundreds or even thousands of years. Today, they survive mostly as myths, legends, or origin tales. And though these stories often contain imaginative elements, they also include patterns and details that raise interesting questions about the periods of human history that left little archaeological trace. When the physical record falls silent, these stories sometimes continue speaking. Myths are not usually treated as historical evidence. They transform events into symbols, exaggerate experiences, and simplify ideas so they can be remembered easily. Yet they also preserve traces of real environments, real challenges, and real disruptions. When a story appears in one culture, it may simply reflect local imagination. But when similar themes appear across cultures that never interacted, it hints at shared experiences so old that only stories remained. Many traditions describe earlier ages of humanity, times when people lived differently, moved differently, or faced circumstances unlike anything known today. These descriptions vary, but some patterns are hard to ignore. One of the most widespread themes involves a time when a great change occurred, sometimes described as a flood, sometimes as fire, sometimes as darkness or cold. These aren't references to a single event. They appear in stories from island nations, mountain groups, desert cultures, and forest communities. Though each story has its own structure, the idea of a sudden shift that erased a previous way of life is almost universal. In coastal areas, many myths describe land that once lay above water but now sits beneath the sea. These tales often mention villages, forests, or paths now lost. While these accounts sound imaginative, geological studies show that coastlines changed drastically at the end of the last ice age. Shorelines moved by hundreds of meters in some places, kilometers in others. Entire landscapes disappeared underwater. For those who lived through these changes, the loss would have been enormous, yet their physical traces would now lie far beneath the waves. In this case, myth preserves a memory that archaeology cannot easily access. Another common theme involves people who travelled vast distances or relocated suddenly. Many cultures have stories describing migrations triggered by environmental or cosmic disruptions. They speak of groups leaving well-established homelands and journeying across unfamiliar territory. Archaeological evidence sometimes aligns with these migrations, but the actual causes often remain unclear. Myths provide context, suggesting that these movements may have been responses to changes that left little in the physical record, changes in climate, resources, or even social structure. These stories serve as potential windows into periods when populations shifted too quickly or too quietly for archaeology to track. Some myths describe knowledge or skills possessed by earlier people that later generations struggled to understand. These accounts often appear as stories of ancestors who built structures or shaped the land in ways the storytellers themselves no longer practiced. Instead of framing these ancestors as supernatural beings, many cultures speak of them simply as people who lived in a different era. They had expertise unfamiliar to later generations. When archaeologists examine older layers showing unusual construction, or advanced planning followed by simpler techniques, these myths gain new relevance. They may reflect memories of lost traditions or forgotten methods rather than inventions of the imagination. A different category of myths speaks about communication between distant groups. In these stories, people from different lands or islands sometimes traded, visited, or learned from one another. Geography would seem to make some of these accounts improbable, yet genetic and linguistic studies sometimes reveal connections between populations far earlier than expected. These connections appear long before established trade networks. The physical artifacts remain sparse, but the stories survive, suggesting that knowledge moved in ways not fully visible in the archaeological record. There are also traditions describing periods when humans and animals interacted differently. Some stories mention animals behaving with unusual familiarity, or humans understanding animal habits with uncanny precision. These stories often reflect ecological conditions from long-gone eras. For example, myths in North America describe animals that resemble extinct megafauna. Some stories mention lakes, forests, or grasslands that match landscapes visible only in geological reconstructions. When these stories were first recorded by anthropologists, they were treated purely as fiction. Later studies show that some of the details align with Ice Age environments. These myths preserved a memory of ecosystems that vanished many thousands of years before. Symbolic tales also raise interesting questions. Many cultures maintain stories featuring spirals, circles, or repeated geometric patterns that appear in ancient carvings. Some myths explain these patterns as representations of cycles, seasons, migrations, or celestial movements. When these same patterns appear carved into stone or painted on cave walls, it becomes possible that they once carried shared meanings across distant regions. The physical symbols alone cannot explain their significance, but the stories give clues to how early people may have used them to track time, observe the sky, or record important events. Another recurring motif describes an age before farming, when people lived in a world of abundance. These stories often mention landscapes rich in game and plants, where life required little labour. Over time, this imaginary age ended, and people were forced to adapt. While the idyllic nature of these tales may be exaggerated, they could preserve early memories of environments that were more productive than the ones that followed. Climate records show that some regions once supported far larger populations than they do now. Myths may echo the transition from these favourable conditions to later periods when resources grew scarce. Stories about ancient structures provide yet another point of interest. In many regions, myths describe buildings or sacred places constructed by ancestors whose identities remain unknown. Sometimes these structures exist physically. At other times, The stories reference places that have not yet been found or may no longer exist. Even when these tales exaggerate, they suggest that people encountered remnants of earlier societies and tried to make sense of what they saw. Their interpretations formed stories. Those stories then travelled through generations, long after the material evidence faded. Some of the most detailed myths concern the sky. Many early cultures preserved stories about patterns in the stars, the movement of the sun, or rare celestial events. These descriptions often correspond to astronomical cycles that require long-term observation. Some myths even reference star positions that match ancient skies rather than modern ones. This suggests that people once tracked patterns carefully enough for the memory to survive in story form. These stories often outlast the physical sites used for observation, which might erode or vanish entirely. Another subject that appears frequently is the idea of lost homelands. These stories mention places where ancestors once lived but could not return to. Sometimes the reason involves natural disaster. In other cases, the reason remains vague. These accounts hint at real migrations or displacements that occurred so long ago that only fragments of memory remain. If people moved quickly or over great distances, they may not have left behind durable archaeological evidence. The stories then become the only surviving record of those movements. Some myths describe early conflicts, not in the form of detailed battles, but as disruptions that change the course of life. These conflicts might involve competing groups or escalating tensions that eventually broke communities apart. Archaeology sometimes identifies layers suggesting population decline or cultural fragmentation without clear signs of violence. The stories could reflect social pressures that cause people to disperse, shift lifestyles, or abandon traditions in ways that left little trace. There are also accounts of early knowledge that later generations viewed with confusion. These stories often involve ancestors who understood the land or sky in unusual ways. They might describe people who could predict weather or seasonal changes with accuracy. Modern interpretations sometimes exaggerate these abilities, but if early groups study patterns over longer periods than later groups, they might have developed profound knowledge that was gradually lost. Myths can compress complex practices into simple narratives, preserving only their essential form. Another type of story describes a period when everything changed at once. These stories often come from cultures with no contact between them, yet they contain similar features. They speak of sudden events that separated one age of humanity from another. Sometimes the change involves water, sometimes it involves fire, cold, or darkness. While these elements are symbolic, they might reflect real disruptions like rising sea levels, volcanic activity, droughts, or shifts in climate. Archaeologists sometimes find evidence of environmental change during the same periods when myths describe transformations. The physical record cannot capture how people experience these changes emotionally or socially, but the stories provide that missing context. Even myths about giants or unusually skilled ancestors may hold traces of real memories. These stories often reflect encounters with earlier populations whose habits, lifestyles, or technologies differed significantly. The exaggerated scale might not refer to physical size, but to perceived differences in ability or knowledge. When later generations encountered the remains of older structures or tools, they may have created stories to explain why those objects seemed beyond their own capabilities. Some traditions preserve detailed genealogies that trace back far beyond recorded history. While these genealogies are not literal, they sometimes encode information about migrations, alliances, or social shifts. Each repeated name may represent a group rather than an individual. These genealogies can span periods where the archaeological record becomes thin or silent. They offer continuity when the material evidence does not. Linguistic patterns also appear in myths. Certain phrases, names, or concepts remain embedded in stories long after their original meanings disappear. These linguistic remnants can reveal older layers of cultural memory. When the same linguistic elements appear in unrelated cultures, they hint at ancient connections now invisible archaeologically. Stories involving animals often preserve ecological knowledge. They describe migrations, behaviours, or habitats that match scientific reconstructions of ancient environments. These details persist even after those animals disappear or the ecosystems change. Myths can therefore offer indirect information about landscapes that vanished long ago. Other myths refer to an earlier time when people possessed understanding of sound, measurement, or observation that later generations lacked. These references align with archaeological anomalies where early technologies appear unexpectedly advanced. While myths exaggerate, they may reflect genuine memories of lost methods. There are also stories about individuals or groups who carried knowledge from one place to another, often across long distances. These accounts correspond loosely to patterns seen in genetics and linguistics. They may describe ancient movements that left little physical evidence but contributed to cultural development. Across all these examples, myths survive because they adapt. They retain the parts that are easy to remember, the parts that resonate emotionally, and the parts that connect to shared identity. The detailed explanations disappear, but the core experience remains. This survival allows myths to carry echoes of events far older than the archaeological record can easily capture. When comparing these stories to the physical gaps discussed earlier, they help fill in the outline. Myths do not provide exact dates or measurable evidence, but they offer context for abrupt changes, lost knowledge, ancient migrations, and environmental transformations. They show that early humans reacted to challenges in ways that left emotional imprints even when material traces vanished. As these stories accumulate across regions and eras, they form another layer of the missing past. They are not proof, but they are signals. They reveal memories of periods that archaeology struggles to document, pointing toward experiences that shaped humanity in ways still visible in culture today. Attempts to understand humanity's earliest knowledge often begin with the assumption that learning unfolded slowly. People observed their surroundings, experimented over generations, and gradually built new skills. But scattered throughout the ancient world are signs that early groups understood things they supposedly should not have known yet. These signs are not dramatic revelations or advanced inventions. They are small, persistent indicators that early humans possessed knowledge about the environment, the sky, materials, and navigation far earlier than expected. When examined closely, these hints raise questions about where such understanding originated, how it was passed on, and why it sometimes seems to appear fully formed before fading again. One of the clearest examples involves early awareness of celestial patterns. Many ancient sites contain alignments with the sun or moon, often so precise that they require long-term observation. These alignments appear in structures far older than any written calendar. Simple rings of stones, lines etched into rock, or openings in caves all show careful positioning relative to solstices or moon cycles. To create such alignments, people needed to track the sky for years, perhaps decades. They needed to notice that the sun rises at different points along the horizon throughout the year and then returns to the same points annually. The ability to track these cycles implies planning, patience, and consistency. Yet these early observers are assumed to be groups focused mainly on survival, moving frequently and living in small numbers. The knowledge embedded in these alignments feels too organized for such circumstances. Another surprising area involves understanding of seasonal behavior in plants and animals. Some early groups appear to have predicted when specific plants would bloom or when animals would migrate. This knowledge requires repeated observation over long periods. For people assumed to be constantly moving, gathering this level of detail would be difficult. Yet some archaeological sites show traces of selective harvesting or preparation that align with predictable seasonal events. This suggests ancient humans had stable enough lifestyles to track cycles and pass the information forward. If that is the case, then the traditional view of early humans as primarily opportunistic gatherers becomes too limited. Navigation also presents puzzles. Artifacts found far from their source suggest early people travelled great distances or maintained networks of exchange. To navigate effectively across long distances, people needed an understanding of landmarks, weather patterns, and possibly the positions of celestial bodies. Many cultures later used the stars for navigation, but the idea that this skill began early seems difficult to reconcile with the assumed simplicity of early societies. Yet some tools and markings hint that people may have followed seasonal star paths or used the horizon to guide movement. These signs are subtle but consistent. They indicate familiarity with the night sky that exceeds what would be expected from people who had no need for long-distance travel. One of the more unusual categories of knowledge involves geometry. In certain regions, ancient communities arranged stones, dwellings, or even small mounds in patterns that reflect geometric thinking. They may not have used formal measurements, but they clearly understood consistent spacing and symmetry. Creating a circle of stones, for example, requires more than placing objects randomly. It requires understanding how to maintain equal distance from a central point. Evidence for such arrangements appears earlier than the timeline comfortably allows. They suggest a familiarity with spatial relationships and planning often attributed to later agricultural societies rather than the earliest groups. There are also hints that early people understood the behaviour of sound. At some ancient sites, stone walls or cave formations appear to amplify or focus sound in specific ways. These features might have been discovered accidentally, but in certain locations the positioning seems intentional. Early groups may have used these acoustic effects for communication or ceremony. Understanding how sound travels requires experimentation. While not advanced science, it reflects curiosity and awareness that does not always appear in the archaeological record. If these early communities paid enough attention to sound to incorporate it into their structures, then their understanding of the environment may have been more sophisticated than assumed. A separate category of knowledge relates to the ability to work with heat. Creating controlled heat for cooking or warmth is simple, but maintaining consistent temperatures for shaping stone or preparing pigments is not. Some early groups produce pigments that remain vibrant thousands of years later. These pigments involve mixtures heated at specific temperatures. Such mixtures require understanding how materials change under heat, even if that understanding was entirely practical rather than theoretical. Producing consistent results implies that the methods were taught deliberately. Yet these practices often appear in early layers and then vanish for long stretches, suggesting knowledge was lost and later rediscovered. The same pattern appears in early examples of storage. Some ancient communities constructed pits or containers that kept food cool, dry or preserved for long periods. These storage features reflect an understanding of temperature, humidity, and decay. They also show long-term planning. If early people were capable of organising food storage, it suggests they were thinking ahead in ways that contradict the idea of constant mobility. Such storage often appears much earlier than agriculture, undermining the assumption that food preservation developed only after settled farming. Burial practices also carry signs of unexpected knowledge. In some regions, early burials include pigments, stones, or tools placed in positions that appear symbolic. These arrangements imply belief systems or ideas about death that require conceptual thinking. While belief itself is not technology, the consistency of burial patterns indicates that people were teaching these ideas across generations. The sophistication of some burial traditions challenges assumptions about the cognitive development of early humans. They suggest people may have held social structures or shared values more complex than the timeline predicts. Another surprising area of knowledge involves early water management. In several locations, ancient groups created small channels or barriers to guide water. These systems may not have been large or elaborate, but they demonstrate awareness of hydrology. Understanding how water moves requires observation and planning. Some communities use gravel to improve drainage or place stones to stabilize paths near water sources. These techniques appear before the development of large agricultural societies. Their presence suggests that early humans understood their environment well enough to manipulate it intentionally. Mapping and representation also raise questions. Some ancient carvings or markings resemble maps of local landscapes. They show rivers, hills, or paths in simplified form. Interpreting these markings is challenging because many are abstract, yet some match geographical features closely enough to suggest they were intentional representations. If early people created maps, even simple ones, it implies spatial awareness and memory that exceed expected levels for their era. It also suggests they travelled enough to require representations of the land. Certain groups appear to have understood how to maintain controlled fire for long periods, sometimes even transporting embers from one location to another. Keeping fire alive requires attention and planning. It also requires knowledge of which materials maintain heat best. This practice indicates that early people developed strategies for ensuring warmth and cooking, even when conditions made fire starting difficult. Such strategies align more closely with later techniques than with the unpredictable fire use often attributed to early humans. There are also hints that people understood the movement of water underground. In some ancient settlements, wells appear in locations unlikely to be chosen randomly. These wells seem placed above aquifers or natural channels. While this may reflect trial and error, the frequency with which wells appear in successful locations suggests early people had methods for identifying water sources. This would require observing surface features, soil moisture, and plant growth patterns, integrating information in ways not typically associated with early groups. Some of the most perplexing examples involve early knowledge of specialized materials. For instance, certain communities use volcanic glass for tools, even when living far from volcanic regions. This implies either long-distance travel or strong networks through which materials were exchanged. But beyond the distance, the knowledge required to identify and value such materials is significant. Volcanic glass has specific properties that make it ideal for cutting. Recognizing these properties requires experimentation or familiarity passed down through generations. Another surprising area involves early knowledge of animals. Some ancient groups appear to have understood not only animal behavior, but also seasonal patterns, migration routes, and population cycles. They may have used this knowledge to predict when herds would appear or where certain species would travel. This type of ecological understanding requires long-term observation and stable living conditions. It suggests an early form of environmental awareness that transcends mere reaction to immediate conditions. In a few rare cases, ancient objects appear with markings that seem to track cycles such as lunar phases. These markings do not represent formal writing, but they do record patterns. If early humans were tracking cycles intentionally, it implies they noticed repetition over long spans of time. Tracking the moon, for example, requires noting changes night after night. Doing so consistently implies that certain individuals or groups were responsible for observing and teaching these patterns. The ability to record them shows conceptual understanding not commonly attributed to early periods. The ability to predict weather also appears in some traditions. Early communities often chose settlement locations based on wind patterns, rainfall, and seasonal changes. Archaeological evidence shows repeated occupation in places protected from storms or flooding. These choices reflect knowledge about climate behaviour. While this may seem intuitive, consistent decisions across generations indicate cultural learning rather than isolated guesses. Some legends describe ancestors who understood the sky in remarkable detail. While these stories should not be taken literally, they reflect a cultural memory of close observation. If people spent long nights watching the stars for navigation or ceremony, they could develop sophisticated knowledge through practice. The archaeological record rarely preserves such observation, but myths and alignments give clues that it existed. Across all these examples, the same issue emerges. Early humans demonstrated knowledge that appears too organized, too consistent, or too advanced for the timeline in which it appears. This does not imply lost civilizations or dramatic theories. Instead, it suggests that early knowledge developed unevenly. Some groups achieved insights earlier than others. Some preserved those insights. Others lost them due to population declines, migration, or cultural changes. The knowledge that ancient people shouldn't have had becomes less mysterious when viewed as part of a larger pattern. Human ingenuity has never been linear. It appears, disappears, and reappears. It develops in isolated pockets. It depends on stability, communication, and memory. The anomalies reveal that early humans were capable of much more than the simplified image often presented. Evidence of human knowledge rising earlier than expected naturally brings up another question, one that complicates almost every attempt to build a consistent timeline. If early communities developed insights, skills, and practices that seem ahead of their era, then something must have happened later to interrupt those traditions, not once, but repeatedly. Human history contains long stretches where knowledge appears, flourishes, and then vanishes, leaving later generations without awareness of what their ancestors once understood. This recurring loss shapes the story of humanity just as much as discovery does. It creates a pattern in which progress is not a steady climb, but a series of rises and declines. Each decline reshapes the way human minds approached memory, learning, and continuity. In many archaeological records, the signs of forgetting are visible long before written history begins. A community may build structures using methods that show planning and collaboration. Then, in the next layer, those methods disappear. The dwellings become simpler. The tools lose their refinement. The symbols that once appeared regularly stop showing up. These changes don't look like improvements. They look like a return to more basic strategies. It suggests that knowledge once held collectively was allowed to fade, either because the population changed or the people no longer had the conditions needed to maintain complex traditions. This raises an important point about early societies. Knowledge at that time was not stored in books or written records. It lived entirely in human memory. Skills were passed from parent to child, from elders to younger members of the group. Stories preserved observations. Rituals preserved practices. Teaching required time, stability, and cooperation. If any of these elements weakened, if a population became smaller, if a group moved frequently, if leadership changed, or if environmental pressures disrupted daily life, knowledge could disappear quickly. A few lost generations could erase methods that took centuries to develop. There are many examples where early populations displayed impressive awareness of their surroundings, only for that awareness to diminish later. Some groups once tracked animal migrations with enough accuracy to predict seasonal movement. Later groups in the same region relied on opportunistic hunting instead. This shift suggests that detailed ecological knowledge was forgotten. Likewise, early signs of complex toolmaking sometimes give way to simpler tools in later eras. The people may have lost the techniques needed to create refined blades or composite tools. They may have had fewer opportunities to practice, or they may have prioritized other tasks as environments changed. The brain's relationship with memory also plays a role. Human memory is not a perfect archive. It favors stories, emotional experiences, and patterns. Practical knowledge must be reinforced regularly to survive. When populations thin or move, the essential reinforcement weakens. Skills that once required community effort become impossible for individuals to maintain alone. Over time, those skills fade. The archaeological silence that follows may represent not just migration, but also forgotten techniques, erased by the natural limits of memory. Another factor is the fragility of oral traditions. Oral transmission works best when communities remain stable and interconnected. If a group splits into smaller units, each branch may preserve different parts of the collective knowledge. Over generations, the branches drift further apart. Some retain fragments of the original understanding. Others lose entire portions. This fragmentation becomes visible in myths that share a common root but diverge significantly in meaning. It also appears in tool traditions that begin the same and then separate into distinct styles without clear progression. Large disruptions accelerate this process dramatically. Floods, droughts, temperature shifts, or sudden environmental changes can scatter populations. When people disperse, they lose not only material possessions, but also the mental patterns required to maintain their knowledge. In such circumstances, groups focus on immediate survival rather than long-term learning. Traditions that rely on careful teaching or repeated practice become difficult to sustain. Over time, the knowledge vanishes, leaving descendants puzzled by the work of earlier generations. This process can be seen in regions where early settlements show signs of structure and planning that later settlements lack. The people did not become less intelligent. They simply lost access to the systems that supported their earlier knowledge. If a society once depended on large gatherings, shared ceremonies, or communal construction techniques, those practices would become impossible if the population declined or moved. Without the social framework, the knowledge embedded in those activities faded. Even more striking is the loss of symbolic knowledge. Patterns carved into stones, painted on cave walls, or embedded in rituals often served as memory aids. They helped preserve information about seasons, migration, weather, or shared stories. When those symbols disappear from the archaeological record, it suggests that the communities either no longer understood their meaning or no longer saw value in preserving it. This loss reflects a deeper shift in how people related to the world around them. Without shared symbols, knowledge becomes more practical and less tied to communal identity, making it harder to pass on across generations. Another example involves early awareness of celestial cycles. Many ancient sites show alignments that required long-term observation of the sky, but these alignments often disappear for long periods. Later groups living in the same region seem unaware of the earlier astronomical knowledge. Without continuous observation, the cycles become harder to recognize. Each generation must rediscover patterns that earlier people took for granted. If environmental pressures disrupted the ability to observe the sky regularly, the knowledge could be lost completely. A similar pattern appears in the disappearance of early engineering solutions. Some communities built foundations, platforms, or drainage systems that showed thoughtful understanding of landscape and water. Later groups in the same regions built simpler structures, lacking the earlier precision. This isn't a matter of preference. It reflects the disappearance of shared practices. Once the older systems fell out of use, people no longer had the opportunity to learn why they worked or how to maintain them. The knowledge faded naturally, silently, without dramatic events. There are also signs that early people understood certain plant or animal behaviours that later populations forgot. Residue analysis on ancient tools shows early use of plants that were later ignored for long periods. Some plants may have been used for medicine, others for food processing. The disappearance of these practices suggests that knowledge of the plant's usefulness faded through lack of practice. Similarly, early evidence of cooperative hunting strategies disappears in some regions for long intervals, implying a shift in how people organized themselves or viewed animal behavior. Population fluctuations play a major role in this. When populations grow, knowledge spreads more easily. Specialization becomes possible. People can observe, experiment, and teach. When populations shrink, specialization becomes unsustainable. Everyone must focus on survival, leaving little room for experimentation. The decline in population causes a decline in knowledge, which in turn affects the ability to adapt. Over time, this leads to a cycle where knowledge appears, vanishes, and returns only when conditions stabilize again. Some archaeological patterns show this clearly. A region may experience a period of innovation marked by new tools, structured dwellings, or organized spaces. Then the record becomes sparse. When it resumes, the new material culture looks unrelated to what came before. This isn't necessarily evidence of a population replacement. It may reflect an internal reset, an era in which knowledge was lost and later rebuilt from simpler foundations. Linguistic evidence supports this idea. Many language families show signs of earlier complexity that later became simplified. Inflections, tones, or grammatical structures may disappear over time as populations fragment or shift. Language simplification often reflects social disruption. When populations mix or disperse, complex structures become harder to maintain. People adjust language for clarity, abandoning older forms that require more specific knowledge. This pattern parallels the archaeological evidence in which material complexity rises and falls. A particularly striking example of forgetting appears in regions where people rediscovered the same techniques multiple times. Heat treatment of stone, for instance, appears early in some layers, disappears, and then reappears thousands of years later in unrelated contexts. The technique clearly worked well, yet it wasn't passed consistently across generations. Its loss suggests that certain practices were too fragile to survive changes in population, environment, or social organization. Some myths reflect memories of this forgetting. They speak of earlier people who knew the ways of the land or understood the sky, while later generations struggled to match their ancestors' abilities. These stories may exaggerate, but they often reveal awareness that something once known had been lost. The stories themselves sometimes become the only remaining trace of forgotten knowledge. Their persistence shows how people responded emotionally to discontinuity, trying to preserve some part of what vanished. The forgetting did not only affect practical knowledge, it also reshaped how people thought about the past. When early traditions disappeared, later groups often created stories to account for the remains they encountered. A foundation built by ancestors became a sacred site. A carved stone became a symbol of unknown meaning. A set of unusual tools became the work of people who came before us. This reinterpretation changed the narrative of history. Instead of continuous development, people saw themselves as inheritors of a world shaped by unknown predecessors. Their understanding of ancestry, identity, and purpose shifted accordingly. This reshaping of memory influenced how knowledge moved forward. When traditions were lost, later groups sometimes reinvented practices without recognizing their earlier origins. This reinvention gives the appearance of discovery when it may actually be recovery. In some cases, similarities between old and new techniques arise not because of direct inheritance, but because people continue to face similar challenges and eventually found solutions resembling those of their ancestors. The effects of forgetting become even clearer when looking at transitions into later ages. As agriculture spread, knowledge had to be relearned in many places. The skills needed to cultivate land, manage water, and store food emerged unevenly. In some regions, early experiments with plants appear in ancient layers but vanish, only to reappear much later when conditions improved. This suggests that cultivation was attempted, forgotten, and rediscovered multiple times before becoming widespread. Even writing systems reflect periods of forgetting. Some early proto-writing marks appear on artifacts long before formal writing developed. These early marks vanish for thousands of years before more structured writing systems arise. The gap suggests that the concept of recording information existed early, but did not stabilize until social structure supported it. Without consistent use, early writing experiments faded, demonstrating again how fragile knowledge can be when dependent on memory and practice. The cumulative effect of these losses reshaped human cognition. Societies became accustomed to discontinuity. They learned to adapt, rebuild, and reinterpret rather than rely on unbroken tradition. This flexibility became one of humanity's defining traits. The ability to recreate knowledge after losing it allowed humans to survive disruptions, migrations, and environmental changes. Forgetting did not weaken humanity. It forced a shift in mindset, encouraging creativity and resilience. At the same time, these cycles of forgetting make the ancient world difficult to understand. The gaps in the record reflect not only missing artifacts, but missing minds, entire ways of thinking erased by time. The traces that remain show that early humans approached knowledge in ways we struggle to reconstruct. Their insights were real, their achievements meaningful, but their continuity fragile. The mind of early humanity was shaped not just by what it learned, but by what it lost. Across the world, there are places where the land seems to hold more memory than the societies that once lived on it. These landscapes preserve patterns, shapes, and marks that remain long after the people who created them disappeared or forgot their purpose. Unlike artifacts that can be moved or shelters that can erode, the land itself keeps traces of activity in its contours, soil layers, vegetation patterns, and hidden formations beneath the surface. These traces persist through generations, and even when the knowledge that shaped them fades, the land quietly stores the evidence. When archaeologists study these regions, they often find signs of intentional alteration that should not exist for the time periods in question. These features reveal a world where early humans interacted with their surroundings in ways that later generations neither replicated nor remembered. In many regions, terraces appear carved into hillsides long before formal agriculture developed. These terraces are not monumental or steep. They may be shallow steps cut into slopes to prevent erosion or manage rainfall. Their construction indicates long-term planning, yet the communities that built them often left no other signs of advanced agriculture. Later populations in the same region sometimes lived without terraces, suggesting they no longer understood or valued the earlier methods. The land remembers the steps even when the people no longer know why they were made. Other landscapes contain remnants of pathways that stretch across surprising distances. These are not roads in the modern sense, but long, narrow stretches of compacted earth, trampled repeatedly over generations. Some paths extend between water sources, high points used for observation, or areas rich in food resources. Their consistency shows they were used intentionally. Over time, the paths remain faint but still visible. Later inhabitants may walk the same routes without knowing that others established them thousands of years earlier. The continuity of use hides the discontinuity of knowledge. In some valleys, the distribution of vegetation hints at past human influence. Certain plants appear in clusters without natural explanation. Their presence suggests earlier communities encouraged their growth or used small-scale methods to manage the environment. These clusters might follow patterns that make harvesting easier or outline areas where people once gathered specific resources. When the communities left or forgot their practices, the plants continued growing, creating patches that reveal choices made long before the reasons were lost. Rivers also hold traces of forgotten interactions. Natural watercourses shift gradually over time, but some rivers show signs of artificial redirection. Subtle curves or straightened sections appear in places where the soil composition demonstrates human influence. These alterations do not match large-scale engineering. They look more like small adjustments made to stabilize banks, manage seasonal flooding, or improve access to certain areas. Even after the human presence disappears, the shape of the river continues to follow the earlier modifications, reflecting decisions no one remembers making. Coastal landscapes offer another type of memory. Many shorelines contain underwater formations that resemble former settlements, paths, or gathering areas. These locations were once dry land before sea levels rose. What remains on the seafloor suggests communities lived there long enough to leave lasting marks. Stone arrangements, fire pits, and levelled surfaces. The rising water preserved the land's memory, but erased the direct human connection. Later generations living inland may have myths about lands swallowed by the sea, but they rarely retain the specific knowledge needed to identify the submerged sites. Underground features add further complexity. Caves often contain soot layers, hearth remains, or marks where people carved, scraped, or leaned objects repeatedly against the walls. Some caves show signs of long-term occupation followed by long periods of abandonment. These pauses reflect shifts in human movement or changes in climate. When people returned generations later, they may not have known who used the caves before them, or why certain marks existed. The cave retains the sequence even when memory does not. Ancient lake beds provide another form of landscape memory. In dry regions, old lake beds reveal patterns of human activity that predate the disappearance of the water. Footprints, tool fragments, and fire pits indicate gathering places or seasonal camps. When the lake dried up, the communities moved or adapted, leaving behind a record that later populations did not replicate. Some of these patterns remain so faint that they are invisible without careful study. Yet the land preserves the story of how people lived during earlier climates, long after cultural memory had shifted to new concerns. Forests also carry traces of forgotten practices. In certain areas, the spacing of trees reflects earlier human cultivation, even if the trees themselves grew long after the people left. Some forests contain plants that thrive only because humans once managed them, burned competing vegetation, or used selective harvesting. These patterns can persist for centuries, giving the forest a structure that differs from truly wild ecosystems. The people who later live near these forests may not realize that the vegetation pattern reflects choices made by ancestors whose methods disappeared over time. Rock formations tell similar stories. Some regions contain stones arranged in ways that look natural until studied closely. These stones might form slight alignments or boundaries that once marked gathering areas or hunting pathways. Their placement is intentional enough to stand out but subtle enough to be overlooked by later inhabitants. As generations pass, the significance disappears, leaving the stones as quiet indicators of human presence that no longer exists in memory. Soil layers hold memories as well. Repeated occupation compacts soil, changes its chemical composition, and alters its colour. When people return to an area after centuries, the soil retains the record of earlier activity even though no one knows it. Sometimes these layers show shifts in behaviour, periods of more intense activity followed by periods of absence. These variations reflect decisions about where to live or gather, decisions that do not survive in oral stories. But the land maintains a record of those movements. Burn patterns in the earth provide another form of memory. Many landscapes show layers of ash that result from deliberate burning rather than natural fires. Controlled burns are used to manage vegetation, clear areas for gathering, or encourage growth of specific plants. In some places, these burn layers appear consistently across long periods and then suddenly stop. The discontinuation suggests a loss of technique or knowledge. The land shows the rhythm of these burns, but later societies living above them rarely understand what they represent. There are also areas where ancient water collection systems remain visible even after their purpose has been forgotten. Shallow depressions, channels, or stone-lined pits might indicate methods of gathering rainwater or storing it for dry seasons. These systems sometimes appear in places where the modern climate no longer supports such practices. Later populations may wonder why such features exist, unaware that the environment once required strategies no longer relevant to their lives. The land preserves the evidence even when human memory no longer connects it to its original purpose. Another example involves migration routes shaped by earlier inhabitants. Some wildlife paths follow ancient human routes, creating corridors that persist through centuries. Animals choose these paths because they offer easier movement through the terrain, unaware that humans once cleared them or used them for seasonal travel. When archaeologists trace these routes backward, they find signs of earlier human presence. Later people living near these areas often use different routes, leaving the older paths as relics known only to the landscape. In certain regions, ancient quarries reveal knowledge that vanished long before later communities developed their own resource extraction techniques. Early people removed stone in systematic ways, leaving cut faces and remnants that show understanding of material properties. These quarries sometimes appear abandoned long before geological conditions changed or new technologies emerged. The abandonment suggests not a shift in resource availability, but a loss of knowledge or a change in priorities. Later groups often stumbled upon these quarries without understanding who created them or how the techniques were developed. Some landscapes display signs of long-term habitation without corresponding cultural memory. Middens, large deposits of shells, bones and other refuse, accumulate over centuries of repeated activity. These piles grow slowly and reveal patterns of diet, social structure and daily habit. When they stop accumulating, it suggests people moved or changed their lifestyles abruptly. But the memory of the midden builders rarely survives. Later communities might settle nearby without knowing that generations lived and ate, in the same spot long before them. Agricultural landscapes offer another window into forgotten knowledge. In some regions, ancient field systems remain faintly visible as lines in the earth or subtle variations in soil colour. These fields reflect early experiments with cultivation, even if the crops themselves no longer exist. Later inhabitants may never attempt farming in the same location, leaving the faint field lines as the only indicator of an early agricultural phase that was forgotten when conditions changed. River deltas store especially complex memories. Layers of silt contain pollen, seeds, and chemical traces of human activity, showing shifts in behaviour over time. These layers might reveal periods when communities harvested specific plants, built temporary structures, or processed materials. When these practices disappear, the delta records the absence even when no story survives to explain it. Mountains also provide clues. In some mountainous regions, ancient shelters appear in high altitudes where later populations never lived. These shelters show signs of repeated occupation, suggesting that early people ventured into these areas for reasons now unknown. Later inhabitants of the region may have no memory of such use, leaving the shelters as isolated traces of forgotten behaviour. Some landscapes contain ancient markers that track celestial events. These markers may involve small stone positions or narrow openings that align with sunrise on specific days. While these features can seem insignificant, they demonstrate long-term observation. When later populations live in the same region without tracking the sky, the markers become mysterious. The land retains the astronomical memory even when cultural knowledge of the sky fades. In rare cases, landscapes contain evidence of environmental manipulation that challenges expectations. Small dams, controlled burns, tree cultivation, and soil enrichment suggest deliberate shaping of the environment. These practices indicate early ecological understanding. When such practices disappear, the land still bears the marks, silently recording choices made long before modern science recognized them. All of these examples share a common theme. The land maintains a memory that people often lose, while humans depend on stories to preserve knowledge. Landscapes preserve actions. They hold the shape of forgotten skills, forgotten journeys, forgotten experiments, and forgotten relationships with the environment. When later cultures encounter these landscapes, they see only the surface, unaware of the deeper patterns below. These forgotten traces highlight the unevenness of human development. Knowledge appears, influences the land, and then disappears, leaving only subtle marks. The land becomes a witness to the cycles of learning and forgetting, providing evidence that human history is far more complex than a simple progression. For certain stretches of ancient history, the most striking feature isn't what people built or how they lived, it's how abruptly their eras came to a close. These endings don't follow the pattern we associate with the major collapses. There are no layers of ash, no signs of war, no widespread famine indicators, no mass graves, and no evidence of sudden environmental disaster. Instead, these eras fade gently but completely, leaving abandoned sites, unfinished structures, scattered tools, and empty regions that remain unoccupied for generations. The absence of a clear cause turns these endings into one of the most persistent puzzles in the study of the ancient world. To understand the magnitude of this problem, imagine an early community that flourished for centuries. The archaeological layers show stability. People made tools with consistent methods, built dwellings in familiar patterns, produced art or symbolic markings, and interacted with their environment in ways that suggest confidence and routine. Then, suddenly, all signs of activity stop. The next layer reveals emptiness. No transition layer appears, no evidence that people migrated gradually, no indication that they were pushed out. It is as though the entire community decided, at nearly the same moment, to leave without recording where they went or why. These endings occur across continents. They appear in highlands, river valleys, deserts, coastlines, and forested regions. The pattern is not confined to a single culture or climate. It repeats in places that had no contact with each other. What makes the phenomenon even more perplexing is that these eras often end during periods when environmental conditions were stable or even improving. If anything, the climate should have supported continued growth. Instead, the archaeological record shows silence. One example appears in regions where early communities built stable dwellings arranged in organised patterns. These structures were used for generations. Some show repairs, expansions and improvements over time. Then, abruptly, construction halts. Tools remain in place as if workers intended to return. Hearths contain ash from incomplete fires. Storage pits hold food that was never retrieved. Yet no signs suggest panic or destruction. Everything simply stops. Later populations sometimes settle nearby, but they never rebuild the earlier structures or continue the earlier traditions. They act as though they have no connection to the people who once lived there. Another case involves regions where early agriculture appeared earlier than expected. These communities experimented with plant cultivation, irrigation, or controlled burning. Archaeologists see the early stages of farming developing slowly, demonstrating growing familiarity with the environment. Then, without warning, the evidence of cultivation disappears. The land returns to a more natural state. The tools associated with farming vanish. Later populations reintroduce cultivation much later, with no sign that they inherited the earlier knowledge. This suggests the end of an agricultural phase that was entirely forgotten, not simply abandoned temporarily. There are places where early groups develop distinctive artistic traditions. Cave paintings, carvings, figurines, and decorative patterns appear in consistent forms across centuries. Each generation maintains the tradition, adding new variations that reflect subtle changes in style. Then the tradition ends. Later communities create entirely different art, with no apparent influence from the earlier style. This suggests a discontinuity in cultural identity, as if the memory of the earlier tradition vanished along with the people who practiced it. In some regions, trade networks formed earlier than expected. Materials from distant areas appear in early layers, shells from coastal zones found in inland settlements, exotic stones appearing far from their sources, pigments travelling across mountains. The presence of these materials indicates widespread interaction, but these networks dissolve abruptly. Trade materials disappear. Settlements become more isolated. Later populations rely on local resources only. The loss of long-distance networks implies a major social change, yet the reason remains unclear. Another striking example involves the design of early shelters. In certain regions, early communities built dwellings using complex methods, interlocking stones, wooden supports arranged in specific patterns, or floors stabilized with layers of earth and organic material. These methods reflect accumulated skill. But after the abrupt ending of the era, later groups built much simpler shelters, lacking the earlier refinement. This backward shift suggests the earlier knowledge was not passed forward, reinforcing the idea of a sudden cultural break. Some of the most puzzling endings appear in populations that left behind carefully planned communal spaces. These spaces might include gathering platforms, storage buildings, or meeting areas. The arrangement suggests a society that valued coordination and shared activity. Yet these communal spaces often show no signs of damage or conflict. They are simply abandoned. When archaeologists examine the layers above these sites, they find either complete emptiness or evidence of entirely different cultural practices. It's as if the organising principles of the earlier society disappeared in a single generation. In other areas, technological experimentation appears to rise suddenly, suggesting a brief period of innovation only to disappear before reaching its full potential. For example, a group may experiment with advanced heat treatment of stone, achieving results that demonstrate precision and control. Then the technique vanishes. Later populations produce tools using much simpler methods. This suggests that the early innovation was not part of a stable cultural tradition, but rather a short-lived phase that ended abruptly and left no lasting legacy. Population genetics adds to the puzzle. In some regions, genetic data shows continuity across long periods, indicating that populations remained in place. Yet the archaeological record shows abrupt cultural endings. This suggests that the people did not disappear, but their traditions did. Something changed in their mindset, organisation, or behaviour that caused them to abandon earlier practices. Understanding what could lead to such shifts requires looking beyond environmental explanations. Environmental factors, while always relevant, do not fully explain these endings. Some regions experience stable climates throughout the silent intervals. Others show minor fluctuations that early populations had already adapted to before. If climate caused these collapses, we would expect signs of stress, malnutrition, reduced population, or desperate attempts to adapt. Instead, the record often shows a sudden stop without preceding struggle. This indicates that the cause might not be environmental at all, or that the environmental factor left no obvious trace. Social explanations also fall short. If conflict caused these endings, weapons or defensive structures should appear. If disease caused the decline, mass graves or biological markers might be expected. Neither appears consistently. The archaeological record rarely shows evidence of violence or health crises during these abrupt endings. In many cases, the sites look untouched. People simply walked away. One possibility involves internal social restructuring. Early groups relied heavily on shared knowledge and communal cooperation. If a key individual died without passing on essential knowledge, or if a shift in leadership disrupted traditional teaching practices, the society could lose the capacity to maintain earlier systems. Without written records, knowledge held by a few individuals becomes vulnerable. But for such an event to reshape entire regions, it would need to occur across multiple communities simultaneously, or within societies facing similar pressures. Another possibility involves changes in mobility. Early groups often shifted between settled and mobile lifestyles, depending on environmental conditions. If a population returned to nomadism, it might leave behind settlements that once reflected stability. Over generations, as people moved more frequently, they might forget earlier building techniques. Their focus would shift towards survival strategies that did not require permanent structures. This could lead to the abandonment of entire villages without conflict or disaster. There are also cases where ideological changes may have played a role. Early symbolic traditions sometimes disappear abruptly, indicating a shift in worldview. If a society changed its beliefs, practices tied to those beliefs might be discarded. This could include settlement patterns, burial arrangements, or artistic traditions. Such shifts may not leave clear material evidence, but they could drastically reshape how people lived. Some researchers propose that memories of earlier eras may have persisted in myths even when material practices vanished. Stories about lost ages, forgotten peoples, or dramatic transformations may reflect real shifts in cultural identity. These stories, preserved orally, show that people were aware that their ancestors lived differently, even if they no longer understood how or why. The absence of material continuity strengthens the idea that the era ended psychologically as well as physically. Another interesting pattern appears in regions where the environment changed slowly, but not catastrophically. Small shifts in rainfall, temperature, or vegetation may have altered resource availability enough to disrupt traditional practices without causing immediate crisis. If a community depended heavily on a specific resource that became less reliable, they might abandon their settlement and move elsewhere. The shift could occur quietly, leaving little trace. Over time, the original settlement might fall into disuse, ending the era without dramatic evidence. There are even cases where early engineering projects suggest significant investment in the landscape, only for these projects to be left unfinished. Channels, terraces, or foundations appear partially completed, then abruptly abandoned. This indicates a collective decision to stop work. The absence of signs of urgency suggests the decision was not forced. Instead, something altered the community's motivation or priorities in a way that archaeology cannot easily capture. Animal remains add another dimension. In some areas, early communities relied on specific species for food or tools. Suddenly, the presence of those species in human layers stops. This could indicate changes in hunting strategies, migrations of the animals, or shifts in diet. Yet these changes do not always align with environmental shifts. Instead, they may reflect cultural decisions, choices that caused the era to end without external causes. Some endings appear to be the result of gradual population decline. Over time, fewer people occupied the settlement, until eventually the community became too small to sustain its traditions. When the last few individuals left, the era ended quietly. But for an entire region to exhibit this pattern, similar pressures must have affected multiple communities. Understanding those pressures remains a challenge, as the archaeological record often lacks the fine detail needed to identify them. Even in cases where material culture changes dramatically, genetic continuity suggests that the people themselves remained. This means the end of the era reflects an internal transformation. It may have involved shifts in social structure, intermarriage with neighbouring groups, or changes in child-rearing practices that altered how knowledge was transmitted. These subtle cultural shifts rarely leave physical traces, yet they can erase entire traditions within a few generations. One of the most thought-provoking aspects of these unexplained endings is their recurrence. They do not represent isolated incidents. They happen repeatedly throughout prehistory. Each time, a flourishing era with distinct practices ends without an obvious cause, leaving later societies to rebuild from simpler foundations or adopt entirely new ways of life. This cycle suggests that forgetting and reinvention were fundamental aspects of early human development. Discussions about the most puzzling parts of early human history rarely take place in the centre of academic conferences. They tend to emerge instead in quiet corners of research labs, private correspondence between specialists, and late-night conversations after long days spent in the field. Scholars usually hesitate to commit these thoughts to formal papers, not because the ideas are extreme, but because the evidence supporting them remains fragmentary. These ideas live in the uncertain space between established knowledge and unanswered questions. They attempt to connect the anomalies that appear in distant regions, the abrupt endings of early eras, the forgotten practices recorded in landscapes, and the surprising knowledge that appears too early in the timeline. They are whispered not because they are dramatic, but because they imply that something fundamental about early human development is missing from our current understanding. Many of these theories begin with a simple observation. The archaeological record does not reflect a smooth progression from primitive behaviour to complex culture. Instead, it presents a pattern of sudden beginnings, unexpected advancements, unexplained disappearances, and long periods of silence. Scholars who study these irregularities often wonder whether early humanity experienced cycles of learning and forgetting more frequently than once assumed. The idea is not that great civilizations rose and fell in total secrecy, but that early societies repeatedly reached levels of cultural complexity that left behind only faint traces. These cycles might have occurred long before writing developed, which means the memory of them would vanish easily. One suggestion involves the possibility that knowledge in early human societies was more widely shared than the archaeological record implies. Instead of relying solely on material evidence, this view considers how quickly ideas could spread through networks of small groups. If early communities interacted across long distances, even sporadically, they could exchange insights without leaving behind durable artifacts. In this model, knowledge becomes more fluid than objects. It travels through conversation, observation, and imitation. When conditions changed, the networks dissolved, and the ideas disappeared with them. This theory attempts to explain why some techniques appear fully formed, then vanish entirely, only to reappear thousands of years later. Another theory focuses on population size. Early human populations were often small and widely dispersed. When populations shrink, cultural knowledge becomes fragile. Scholars sometimes suggest that certain bursts of innovation might have occurred in groups too small to preserve those innovations once their numbers declined. The idea here is that small populations can produce significant breakthroughs, but lack the resilience to maintain them. When the group disperses or diminishes, the knowledge disappears, leaving behind only fragments in the archaeological record. This theory aligns with genetic evidence showing dramatic fluctuations in population size throughout prehistory. Some researchers explore the possibility that early humans possessed modes of teaching or communal memory that differ significantly from those used later. If early knowledge relied heavily on symbolic practices, songs, patterns, ceremonies, then losing a single ritual or abandoning a location associated with teaching could lead to rapid forgetting. This view suggests that ancient knowledge was embedded in social practices rather than individual learning. When those practices changed, the knowledge dissolved. While this idea is difficult to test, it explains why some complex skills appear abruptly and fade just as abruptly. Another line of thought suggests that early humans may have been more observant and attuned to environmental patterns than later societies. Without modern distractions, early people may have spent long periods watching the sky, tracking animals, or monitoring seasonal cycles. This intense observation could lead to insights that appear advanced when viewed through modern expectations. If these insights depended on environmental conditions that no longer exist, later societies might not replicate them easily. This perspective reframes early anomalies as products of deep attentiveness rather than unexplained intelligence. A more unconventional theory proposes that early cultures maintained broader social connections than currently recognized. This doesn't imply advanced transportation, but rather periodic gatherings or seasonal convergence points where groups exchanged knowledge. These gatherings could spread ideas widely without creating material evidence. Once population movement shifted, these gatherings ended, leaving no clear trace. Such a model could explain why similar techniques or symbols appear across distant regions within similar time frames. The knowledge may have spread through human networks that archaeology struggles to reconstruct. Some scholars consider the role of environmental stability. Periods of stable climate might have allowed early populations to settle longer, observe more, and refine knowledge. When stability broke down, these populations dispersed and lost the conditions that supported learning. In this model, knowledge development depends heavily on long, uninterrupted spans of predictability. Once those spans ended, the societies that depended on them dissolved quietly. This theory fits regions where the archaeological record shows sudden endings during periods of subtle environmental change rather than catastrophic events. There are also theories focusing on cognitive development. These ideas suggest that early humans may have had mental capacities that express differently from modern cognition. This does not imply superiority or inferiority, but differences in how memory, attention, and observation were prioritized. Some anthropologists speculate that early human minds may have been especially skilled at noticing natural patterns or interpreting subtle cues in the landscape. As societies grew more complex, attention shifted toward new priorities, altering the way knowledge was perceived and preserved. This slow shift in cognitive emphasis might explain why certain types of early knowledge seem surprisingly refined yet fail to persist. A related idea involves the concept of knowledge loss as an evolutionary strategy. In some models, forgetting unnecessary information helps species adapt by freeing cognitive resources. If early humans relied on flexible behavior rather than long-term planning, they may have discarded knowledge that no longer served immediate needs. This could result in abrupt endings to certain traditions without any external cause. While speculative, the theory recognizes that forgetting is an active part of cognition, rather than a passive failure. Another group of scholars explores the possibility that early humans experienced social restructurings that archaeology cannot easily detect. These restructurings might include shifts in hierarchy, roles, or cooperation that changed how knowledge was passed on. For example, a leader who emphasized certain practices could influence an entire community. If that leadership changed, core practices might disappear quickly. Without written records, such social transformations appear only indirectly through the material record's gaps. Some theories revolve around the idea of selective memory within communities. Early humans may have chosen to preserve certain practices while discarding others deliberately. Cultural choices, rather than loss, could explain why some symbolic traditions persist while technical knowledge fades. Communities may have prioritized identity-building practices over more practical ones, leading to the survival of myths but not methods. This interpretation reframes forgetting as a cultural choice, rather than an unavoidable consequence of disruption. A few researchers explore the possibility of external influences, though not in the sensational ways often portrayed in popular culture. Instead, these theories examine how interactions with migrating groups or neighbouring populations might have introduced new ideas temporarily. These ideas could spark innovations that disappear when the interactions end. The neighbouring group may not have settled permanently, leaving limited archaeological evidence of their presence. This framework explains how certain knowledge appears abruptly, without requiring large-scale migration or dramatic cultural replacement. Some of the more controversial theories ask whether we misunderstand the scale of early human mobility. If people travelled farther or more frequently than expected, they could have exchanged knowledge widely without leaving dense settlement patterns. Long-distance travel does not always produce significant artefacts. A group passing through a region may leave only faint traces. If early humans were more mobile than assumed, they could have created networks of knowledge that archaeology struggles to detect. There are also hypotheses involving psychological responses to environmental change. When landscapes altered slowly, early humans may have interpreted these changes symbolically rather than practically. These interpretations could influence behaviour in ways that do not leave material evidence. For example, a slight shift in river patterns might lead communities to relocate for reasons tied to belief rather than survival. The relocation would end an era without leaving signs of stress, creating the appearance of an unexplained disappearance. Some researchers examine how early humans managed risk. In unpredictable environments, societies may adopt strategies that prioritize flexibility. If an era's methods made sense only under stable conditions, a shift in risk perception could cause people to abandon them suddenly. This could explain why complex practices sometimes end without clear external pressure. The decision to stop may have been rooted in a change in perceived danger, not actual danger. Another idea explores how early people responded to generational turnover. If each generation modified traditions based on immediate needs, long-term continuity would be fragile. The cumulative effect of small changes might eventually lead to the disappearance of entire practices. This gradual erosion of knowledge could create abrupt endings in the archaeological record, even if the change felt natural to those living through it. There are even theories involving the role of luck. Some breakthroughs may have been the result of chance, an unusually skilled individual, an exceptionally stable local environment, or a rare combination of resources. When the circumstances changed, the knowledge could disappear simply because it had never been widely distributed. While not a satisfying explanation on its own, chance may contribute to the unevenness of early development. Most of these theories share one underlying theme. The archaeological record captures only the material residue of human activity, not the cognitive, social, or emotional forces that shaped it. Early humans lived in a world where knowledge depended on memory, cooperation, and continuity, all of which can fail quietly. Scholars whisper about these theories because none of them fully solve the puzzle. Each idea explains part of the mystery, but none explains all of it. Instead, the combined weight of these theories suggests that the missing chapter of human history may not be a single event or lost civilization, but a recurring pattern of rising and fading knowledge shaped by forces that leave only faint marks in the ground. When all the scattered clues are brought together, a strange kind of responsibility begins to take shape. Not the responsibility of solving everything or forcing the past to fit a particular narrative, but the responsibility of acknowledging how much remains unknown. As each unexplained pattern accumulates, abrupt endings, forgotten techniques, vanished eras, myths that echo environments long gone, landscapes that preserve traces people no longer understand, the collective weight forms a question that does not belong to archaeologists alone. It belongs to anyone trying to understand how humans became what they are. The missing pieces of early history do not just describe a distant world. They influence how we interpret our origins, our development, and the fragile line connecting one generation to the next. Modern perspectives often assume progress is steady, that knowledge grows consistently, and that societies move logically from simpler forms to more complex ones. But the evidence from deep prehistory complicates that assumption. The patterns reveal a much more dynamic story. Human development appears to have unfolded in waves, expanding, contracting, rising, falling, and changing direction without clear causes. Knowledge appears abruptly, disappears, returns in different forms, and sometimes leaves landscapes shaped in ways that later populations cannot interpret. This uneven trajectory suggests that humanity itself may have been shaped as much by forgetting as by learning. That realization places modern observers in an uncomfortable but revealing position. Instead of looking back at a clean, connected lineage of ideas, we face a fractured map broken by silence. The gaps raise questions about what it means to inherit the past when much of it did not survive. The mystery does not point toward a hidden civilization or a single event that wiped everything away. Instead, it reveals the fragility of memory, the vulnerability of knowledge, and the immense challenge of maintaining continuity across thousands of years without written records. This fragility brings forward a second realization. The resilience of early humans was not based solely on what they preserved, but also on what they rebuilt after forgetting. Many of the innovations we credit to later periods, agriculture, tool specialization, environmental management, tracking of celestial cycles, show faint traces in much earlier eras. The early attempts did not last, but they created patterns that re-emerged later when conditions allowed. This suggests that the potential for these developments always existed. It surfaced when stability provided space for observation, and then faded when instability returned. Understanding that patterns shifts the question from what early humans lacked to what they possessed but could not maintain. Their world demanded constant movement, adaptation, and resilience. Knowledge could survive only when communities remained stable for long periods, and stability was rare. The alternating pattern of settlement and dispersal repeatedly erased memory, leaving only fragments behind. Those fragments later became the puzzles that researchers now try to assemble. The themes that persist across all the evidence, cycles of learning, sudden transitions, landscapes marked by forgotten practices, myths describing vanished eras, raise another point that scholars often consider quietly. The early human experience may have been far more varied than the simplified models suggest. People did not all follow the same developmental path. Different groups experimented with different ideas. Some advanced certain skills earlier, while others focused on entirely different priorities. The record may show only the communities that lived in places favourable to preservation. Thousands of other groups may have left no lasting traces at all. This raises the unsettling possibility that much of human history took place outside the narrow slice preserved in the ground. The archaeological record may not reveal the full range of ancient experimentation. It may instead reflect the portions of humanity that lived in places where materials lasted, soil chemistry allowed preservation, and chance favoured discovery. The missing chapter of human history may simply be the majority of human experience. Millions of lives that left only faint marks or none at all. Acknowledging that possibility changes how we approach the unanswered questions. Instead of searching for a single explanation, it becomes important to recognize that early humanity likely experienced many different forms of cultural development. Some groups may have lived in ways so fluid or so environmentally dependent that their practices left almost no durable evidence. Others may have held knowledge that required conditions impossible to sustain consistently. When those conditions vanished, the knowledge disappeared with them. What remains are glimpses rather than complete stories, impressions rather than clear narratives. This perspective also reframes the surprising appearances of early geometry, navigation, environmental management, or celestial observation. These puzzles may not indicate anomalies at all, but rather evidence of the natural capacity of human minds to develop complex understanding independently in different contexts. When conditions align, stable resources, cohesive communities, reliable seasonal patterns, knowledge emerges quickly. When those conditions break down, the knowledge fades. The irregularity becomes part of the pattern. The possibility that early humans repeatedly reached similar insights before losing them introduces another idea that scholars discuss quietly. Perhaps the story of human development is not a straight line, but a field of potential. Different groups tapped into different parts of that potential at various times. The record reflects only the moments when those potentials became material enough to leave traces. Everything else, the experiments, the learning, the unrecorded understanding, remains hidden. Yet even if the missing chapter is mostly absence rather than lost civilization, it still shapes the present. It reminds us that human knowledge can vanish unexpectedly. It shows that cultural continuity is fragile. It demonstrates that learning requires not only intelligence, but also stability, cooperation, and memory. It suggests that societies today are not immune to the forces that shaped the past. Knowledge remains dependent on the same variables it always has: stability, communication, shared purpose, and the ability to pass information forward reliably. Another part of the mystery concerns how humans interpret the past. Archaeological evidence often tells us what people did, but not why they did it. Motive, belief, fear, ambition, identity. These forces leave far fewer traces than tools or bones. Yet they shaped behaviour just as strongly in ancient times as they do now. When an era ends abruptly, the physical evidence might not show the mental or emotional changes that triggered the transition. A shift in worldview, a change in leadership, or a new interpretation of the environment could cause entire practices to be abandoned without leaving clear material signals. This limitation forces researchers to acknowledge that the missing chapter may contain more emotional and cognitive history than physical evidence. Another quiet discussion among scholars concerns the longevity of oral memory. Some oral traditions preserve details about landscapes that disappeared thousands of years ago. Others describe migrations that align with genetic data. Some reflect ecological knowledge that matches paleoclimate reconstructions. These examples show that memory can survive incredibly long periods when reinforced consistently. But when reinforcement stops, the knowledge vanishes rapidly. This dynamic raises the question of how many memories once existed that had no chance to survive. The missing chapter may include entire worlds of experience preserved briefly in oral stories before they faded permanently. The landscapes described earlier offer another perspective. When the environment retains traces of forgotten practices, it becomes a form of memory that humans themselves struggle to decode. Terraces, water channels, managed forests, subtle paths, and old quarries all suggest continuity of action, even when cultural memory broke. The land witnessed what people forgot. This duality, material persistence combined with mental fragility, highlights how difficult it is to reconstruct ancient history accurately. Much of what early humans did was preserved not intentionally but accidentally. Much of what they wanted to remember has been lost. This disconnect between material and mental memory leads to yet another quiet theory. The ancient world may have been filled with stories and explanations, that would contextualize the archaeological record if we still had them. But because those stories existed only in spoken form, they disappeared during periods of population decline, migration, or cultural disruption. The missing chapter may be less about lost achievements and more about lost explanations. Without those explanations, even simple practices appear mysterious. When scholars piece together the evidence, they face the ongoing challenge of interpretation. Every artifact is incomplete. Every layer is fragmentary. The record is rich but selective. Understanding why knowledge rose, fell, and reappeared requires imagination tempered by restraint. It requires acknowledging the limits of material evidence while recognizing the complexity of human behavior. It requires holding space for uncertainty while still attempting to map the broader pattern. That broader pattern does not describe a hidden civilization or a singular missing era. Instead, it describes a world where small groups developed deep understanding of their environments, only to lose that understanding when circumstances changed. It describes societies that built stable traditions, then abandoned them quietly. It describes waves of knowledge that left traces only when conditions allowed. It describes periods when human populations became small enough that knowledge could vanish completely, followed by periods when populations grew and rediscovered ideas their ancestors once knew. This cyclical pattern forms the core of the mystery that becomes ours to carry. It challenges modern assumptions about progress. It invites humility in the face of complexity. It reminds us that history is not a steady climb, but a fragile network of attempts, some successful, some forgotten, many invisible. The missing chapter is not a single lost story, but a reminder that our understanding of humanity remains incomplete. And because it is incomplete, the questions continue. They pass from one generation of researchers to the next, each group adding new discoveries while leaving others unresolved. The mystery becomes part of how we study the past, part of how we imagine the future, and part of how we understand ourselves.